Hello friends. Did you know nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy these stories, please hit that subscribe button and leave a like. It really helps. Thank you for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. Luther Grady had been driving trucks for 23 years, and in all that time he'd learned one fundamental truth about the profession. The real money wasn't on the main highways. It was on the backroads, the forgotten stretches of asphalt that wound through places most people had never heard of and would never visit. The big shipping companies stuck to the interstates, which meant their drivers fought over the same routes, undercutting each other's rates until nobody was making decent money anymore. But Luther had figured out a different approach entirely. He'd spent years cultivating relationships with small-town suppliers, mom-and-pop operations that needed goods moved but couldn't afford the rates the big companies charged. It wasn't glamorous work, and the roads were often in terrible condition, but it paid better than anything he could get with the major freight lines. He'd been working one particular route for about 8 months now, running between Billings and a series of small towns in the northwestern part of Montana, places so remote they barely showed up on most maps. The route took him through some of the most beautiful and desolate country he'd ever seen, vast stretches of rolling hills and dense pine forests that seemed to go on forever in every direction. The town he was heading to this particular November evening was called Mill Ridge, population 347 according to the faded sign at the town limits. Luther had been making deliveries there twice a month since April, dropping off supplies for the general store that served as the town's primary source of everything from groceries to hardware. The owner, a weathered man in his 60s, paid in cash and never asked questions about invoices or insurance, which suited Luther just fine. The arrangement was profitable enough that Luther had started looking for similar opportunities in other isolated communities throughout the state. He'd learned that these small towns, the ones that were slowly dying as young people moved away and businesses closed down, were often desperate enough to work with independent operators like himself. They couldn't be picky about certifications or proper documentation when the alternative was driving 3 hours to the nearest Walmart. Luther had left Billings around 2 in the afternoon, planning to reach Mill Ridge by 8 or 9 that evening. The route he'd mapped out took him off the main highway after about 90 miles, onto a series of county roads that would save him nearly an hour of driving time. He'd driven these roads dozens of times before and knew every curve and pothole by heart. The November sky was already darkening by 4:30, and by 5 it was completely black except for the cone of illumination from his headlights. This was the part of the job that Luther actually enjoyed, the solitude of the open road with nothing but the rumble of the engine and the occasional burst of static from the CB radio to keep him company. He'd tried listening to podcasts and audiobooks like some of the younger drivers did, but he found them distracting. He preferred the silence, or as close to silence as you could get in a truck cab, broken only by the rhythmic thump of the tires against the pavement and the occasional groan of the trailer behind him. The county road he was traveling on had been paved sometime in the distant past, but had long since deteriorated into a patchwork of asphalt and gravel. The truck's suspension absorbed most of the worst bumps, but every so often he'd hit a pothole deep enough to rattle his teeth and make him wonder if he'd just damaged something expensive. The landscape around him was invisible in the darkness, but he knew from previous trips that he was passing through an endless succession of pine forests interspersed with the occasional clearing or abandoned homestead. This part of Montana had been more populated once, back when logging was still profitable and before the mills had closed down. Now it was mostly empty, home to a handful of hardy souls who preferred isolation to whatever comforts civilization might offer. Luther had met a few of them at gas stations and diners, weather-beaten men and women who looked at strangers with suspicion and spoke in terse monosyllables when they spoke at all. Around 6:30, Luther noticed his fuel gauge was getting lower than he liked. He'd planned to fill up in Millridge, but that was still more than 2 hours away, and he didn't want to risk running dry on these isolated roads. He kept an eye out for any sign of a gas station, but the road remained empty of any structure more substantial than an occasional mailbox. Just when he was starting to consider turning back to the last town he'd passed through, his headlights caught a faded sign advertising gas and diesel 5 miles ahead. Luther couldn't remember seeing this station on any of his previous trips, but it was possible he'd simply driven past it during daylight hours without noticing. 5 miles later, exactly as promised, a small gas station materialized out of the darkness. It was a humble operation, just 2 pumps under a rusted metal canopy in a small building that might have been white once but had faded to a dingy gray. A single fluorescent light flickered above the door to the office, and a neon sign in the window advertised beer and cigarettes. Luther pulled up to the diesel pump and shut off the engine. The silence that followed was profound. Luther sat in the cab for a moment, listening to the tick of the cooling engine and the faint whistle of wind through the pines. The gas station appeared deserted, but the lights were on and the pumps looked operational. He climbed down from the cab, his joints creaking after hours of sitting, and approached the pump. It was an older model that required prepayment inside, so Luther headed toward the office. The door opened with a harsh jangle of bells, and Luther stepped into a cramped space that smelled of cigarettes and old coffee. The interior was dimly lit by fluorescent tubes, several of which were either burnt out or flickering. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with the usual assortment of chips, candy bars, and automotive supplies. A glass-fronted cooler hummed against one wall, filled with beer and soda. Behind a counter that looked like it had been salvaged from a 1970s kitchen stood a man Luther had never seen before. The man was tall and thin, probably in his early 60s, with gray hair that hung to his shoulders and a beard that covered most of his face. He wore a flannel shirt that had seen better days and regarded Luther with an expression that wasn't quite friendly, but wasn't hostile either. It was the look Luther had come to recognize in these rural areas, a cautious neutrality that said the locals would tolerate strangers as long as they didn't cause trouble. Luther nodded in greeting and said he needed to fill his tank, diesel pump outside. The man didn't respond verbally, just held out his hand for payment. Luther handed over his credit card and was told the machine was broken, cash only. This wasn't unusual in small-town gas stations, so Luther counted out the bills from his wallet and laid them on the counter. The man swept them into the register without counting them and pressed a button that activated the pump outside. While his tank was filling, Luther wandered around the small store, stretching his legs and browsing the shelves without any real intention of buying anything. The selection was sparse, and many of the items looked like they'd been sitting there for years. A layer of dust covered most of the products, and several of the expiration dates he checked were months or even years past. He was examining a package of beef jerky that claimed to have been made in 2019 when he noticed something odd. Pinned to a bulletin board behind the counter were dozens of photographs, all of them showing the same subject. Trucks. Not just any trucks, but 18-wheelers like his own, photographed from various angles and distances. Some appeared to have been taken during the day, others at night with the flash creating a harsh white glare. What struck Luther as strange was that all of the photographs seemed to have been taken without the driver's knowledge. They were candid shots, capturing trucks at gas stations, pulled over at rest areas, or simply driving past on the highway. Luther studied the photographs more closely, trying to figure out what they meant. Was this guy some kind of truck enthusiast who liked to document the vehicles that passed through his station? That seemed harmless enough, if a bit eccentric. But there was something about the way the photographs were arranged, overlapping and pinned haphazardly to the board, that made Luther uncomfortable. He couldn't quite articulate why, but looking at those dozens of images gave him the same feeling he got when he saw a snake coiled by the side of the road. Not immediate danger exactly, but a warning that he should be careful where he stepped. He was still staring at the bulletin board when he realized the man behind the counter was watching him. Luther turned and forced a smile, mumbling something about heading back outside to check on his fuel. The man didn't respond, just continued to stare with those flat, unreadable eyes. Outside, Luther stood by his truck while the pump continued to fill his tank with a mechanical whir and click. The night air was cold enough to see his breath, and somewhere in the distance he could hear what sounded like an owl calling. The gas station sat in a small clearing carved out of the surrounding forest, and beyond the circle of light from the single fluorescent fixture, the darkness was absolute. Luther found himself thinking about those photographs on the bulletin board. The more he considered them, the more uneasy he felt. There had been something obsessive about the collection, something that went beyond simple interest in trucks. He tried to shake off the feeling, telling himself he was being paranoid. The guy was probably just bored and took pictures to pass the time. People in isolated places developed strange hobbies. It didn't mean anything sinister. The pump clicked off, indicating his tank was full. Luther replaced the nozzle and climbed back into his cab, eager to get back on the road and put this odd little gas station behind him. As he started the engine and prepared to pull away, he glanced at the office window and saw the man standing there, watching him leave. The man's face was partially obscured by the reflection of the fluorescent light on the glass, but Luther could make out enough to see that he was still wearing that same neutral expression. Luther gave a half-hearted wave that wasn't returned, then guided his truck back onto the county road. As the gas station's lights faded in his mirrors, he felt an irrational sense of relief, as if he'd just escaped from something dangerous, even though nothing threatening had actually occurred. He told himself he was being ridiculous and focused his attention back on the road ahead. The route to Millridge continued through increasingly dense forest, the road twisting and turning as it followed the contours of the land. Luther had driven this stretch many times before, but tonight it seemed different somehow. The darkness felt heavier, more oppressive, and the trees that pressed close to the road on both sides seemed to loom over him like silent witnesses. He tried to dismiss these thoughts as the product of his encounter at the gas station, but the feeling persisted. Several times he found himself checking his mirrors, half expecting to see headlights following him, but the road behind remained empty. He passed through 2 more small towns, both of them seemingly deserted at this hour, with only a few lights visible in the windows of scattered houses. At one point he considered stopping at a diner he'd eaten at before, but the parking lot was empty and the place looked closed, so he kept driving. Around 8:15, Luther's CB radio crackled to life with a burst of static followed by a voice. The reception was poor, distorted by distance or atmospheric conditions, but he could make out enough to understand that someone was trying to communicate. The voice was male, older, and seemed to be asking if anyone was monitoring the channel. Luther picked up his handset and responded, identifying himself and his location. There was a long pause, filled only with static, and then the voice came back. The man introduced himself as Sheriff Eldon Tullis of Millridge, and he wanted to know if Luther was the truck driver who'd been making regular deliveries to their town. Luther confirmed that he was, and asked if there was a problem with tonight's delivery. Another pause, longer this time, and when Sheriff Tullis spoke again, his voice sounded strained in a way that made Luther grip the handset tighter. The sheriff said there wasn't a problem with the delivery exactly, but he needed to speak with Luther as soon as he arrived in town. It was important, he emphasized, and it concerned Luther's safety. When Luther asked what he meant, the sheriff seemed reluctant to explain over the radio. He just repeated that it was important, and that Luther should come directly to the sheriff's office when he reached Millridge before making his delivery. Luther agreed, though he felt a knot of anxiety forming in his stomach. The sheriff's tone had been serious, almost grave, and Luther couldn't imagine what kind of safety concern would require an immediate meeting. His mind raced through possibilities. Was there a problem with his truck? Had something happened on one of the roads he'd traveled? Or was this about something else entirely, something connected to the strange gas station and those photographs on the bulletin board? The remaining miles to Millridge passed slowly, each minute stretching out as Luther's imagination conjured increasingly dark scenarios. By the time he saw the town's lights ahead, he'd worked himself into a state of genuine fear, though he couldn't have explained exactly what he was afraid of. Millridge appeared out of the darkness like an island of light in an ocean of trees, its main street lined with buildings that looked like they hadn't changed since the 1950s. The town was quiet, almost eerily so, with no traffic and only a few pedestrians visible on the sidewalks. Luther guided his truck down Main Street following the sheriff's directions to a small brick building at the far end of town. A sign out front identified it as the Millridge Sheriff's Office, and a single patrol car sat in the parking lot. Luther pulled his truck into a space large enough to accommodate it and shut off the engine. For a moment, he sat in the cab, staring at the building and wondering what he was about to walk into. Then he took a deep breath, opened the door, and climbed down into the cold November night. The sheriff's office was warm and brightly lit after the darkness outside. A small reception area led to a larger office beyond, and Luther could see a man sitting at a desk, speaking on a telephone. The man looked up as Luther entered, said something into the phone, and then hung up. He stood and came around the desk, extending his hand in greeting. Sheriff Eldon Tullis was a big man in his 50s, with the weathered face of someone who'd spent most of his life outdoors. He wore a tan uniform with a badge pinned to his chest, and his expression was serious but not unfriendly. He thanked Luther for coming straight over and gestured for him to take a seat in one of the chairs facing the desk. Luther sat down, his unease growing as he waited for the sheriff to explain what this was about. Sheriff Tullis returned to his own chair and leaned back, studying Luther with an intensity that made him want to squirm. Finally, the sheriff spoke. He asked Luther how long he'd been making deliveries to Millridge, and whether he'd noticed anything unusual on his trips through the area. Luther thought about the gas station and those photographs, but he wasn't sure if that qualified as unusual enough to mention. He said he'd been coming to Millridge for about 8 months, and that he generally kept to himself and didn't pay much attention to anything beyond the road. The sheriff nodded slowly, as if this was the answer he'd expected, but not the one he'd hoped for. Then he asked Luther a question that made his blood run cold. Had Luther ever met a woman named Meredith Claiborne? The name meant nothing to Luther. He shook his head and told the sheriff he'd never heard of anyone called Meredith Claiborne, and he certainly hadn't met her. Sheriff Tullis seemed to deflate slightly at this response, as if he'd been hoping for a different answer. He reached into a desk drawer and pulled out a photograph, sliding it across the desk toward Luther. The image showed a woman in her late 30s or early 40s, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and a serious expression. She was attractive in an understated way, with sharp features and intelligent eyes. Luther studied the photograph for several seconds, trying to place the face, but he was certain he'd never seen this woman before in his life. He told the sheriff as much and asked what this was about. Sheriff Tullis took the photograph back and stared at it for a moment before speaking. Meredith Claiborne, he explained, had been a resident of Millridge for the past 7 years. She'd moved to town from somewhere back east, the sheriff wasn't sure exactly where, and had kept mostly to herself. She lived in a small house on the outskirts of town, worked remotely doing something with computers, and rarely socialized with the other residents. People in Millridge had learned to respect her privacy, the way small-town folks often did with newcomers who made it clear they wanted to be left alone. There was nothing particularly unusual about her, nothing that would have drawn attention or concern, until about 6 weeks ago when she'd suddenly vanished. The sheriff paused here, letting this information sink in. Luther felt his stomach tighten. He asked what the sheriff meant by vanished and whether they'd filed a missing person report. The sheriff confirmed that yes, a report had been filed, but the circumstances of her disappearance were complicated. Meredith hadn't left any note or indication of where she was going. Her car was still parked in her driveway, her house was locked up tight, and according to her neighbors, she hadn't mentioned any plans to travel. At first, the sheriff had assumed she might have gone hiking in the surrounding wilderness and gotten lost or injured, so he'd organized search parties to comb the nearby forests and trails. They'd found nothing, not a single trace of her. Then he'd started looking into her background, trying to find family members or friends who might know where she'd gone, and that's when things had gotten strange. Meredith Claiborne, it turned out, barely existed on paper. She had no social media presence, no credit cards, no bank accounts beyond a single checking account at the local bank. The address she'd given when she rented her house led to an empty lot in Pennsylvania. Her references had all been fake. It was as if she'd constructed an entirely false identity for herself, and now that identity had simply evaporated. Luther listened to all of this with growing confusion. He still didn't understand what any of it had to do with him or why the sheriff had asked him to come directly to the office. When he posed this question, Sheriff Tullis leaned forward in his chair and fixed Luther with a look that was equal parts concerned and suspicious. The sheriff explained that in the process of investigating Meredith's disappearance, he'd been reviewing footage from the few security cameras around town, trying to establish a timeline of her last known movements. One of these cameras was positioned at the town's only gas station, and it had captured something interesting. About 2 weeks before Meredith disappeared, the camera had recorded her having a conversation with a truck driver who'd stopped to fill up. The conversation had lasted several minutes, and although there was no audio, the body language suggested they knew each other. The sheriff had shown the footage to several people in town, but nobody recognized the truck driver. That is, until Luther had started making regular deliveries to Millridge. The implication was clear, and Luther felt a surge of anger mixed with fear. He told the sheriff firmly that he'd never met Meredith Claiborne, never had a conversation with her at any gas station, and that whoever was on that security footage, it wasn't him. The sheriff held up his hands in a placating gesture and said he believed Luther, or at least he wanted to believe him. But the truck in the footage had looked very similar to Luther's rig, right down to the company name painted on the side, and the driver had been wearing the same type of jacket Luther had on right now. Could Luther explain that? Luther's mind raced. He thought about the photographs on the bulletin board at that strange gas station, all those images of trucks taken without the driver's knowledge. He thought about the way the man behind the counter had watched him with those flat, expressionless eyes, and suddenly he understood what was happening, or at least he thought he did. Luther told the sheriff about the gas station where he'd stopped earlier that evening, about the photographs of trucks pinned to the bulletin board, and about the uncomfortable feeling he'd gotten from the man who ran the place. He suggested that maybe, just maybe, someone was impersonating truck drivers, using their vehicles and identities for purposes Luther couldn't begin to guess at. The sheriff listened to this theory without interrupting, his expression growing more troubled with each word. When Luther finished, there was a long silence. Finally, Sheriff Tullis asked Luther to describe exactly where this gas station was located. Luther did his best to provide directions, explaining which roads he'd taken and approximately how many miles from Millridge it had been. The sheriff pulled out a map and had Luther trace the route with his finger, marking the approximate location of the gas station. When Luther indicated the spot, the sheriff's expression changed to something Luther couldn't quite read. It was a mixture of confusion and what might have been fear, though the sheriff tried to hide it. He told Luther that according to this map, there was no gas station at that location. In fact, there hadn't been a gas station anywhere along that stretch of road for at least 20 years, not since the old Murphy's service station had burned down back in the early 2000s. Luther insisted that he'd just been there less than 2 hours ago, that he'd filled his tank and paid cash for the fuel. The sheriff asked if Luther had kept his receipt. Luther patted his pockets and realized he hadn't been given one. The man behind the counter had taken his cash and activated the pump without providing any kind of receipt or even acknowledging the transaction beyond that. The sheriff stood up and walked to a filing cabinet, pulling out a folder that he brought back to the desk. He opened it and extracted several photographs, spreading them out where Luther could see them. The images showed the burned-out remains of a building. Nothing left but a concrete foundation and some twisted metal that might have once been gas pumps. Tall grass and weeds had grown up around the ruins, and young trees were beginning to reclaim the space. The sheriff explained that this was all that remained of Murphy's service station, and that he'd driven past this spot himself just yesterday. There was definitely no functioning gas station there, no lights, no man behind a counter, no bulletin board covered with photographs. Luther stared at the images, feeling as if the ground had shifted beneath him. He knew what he'd seen, knew where he'd been, and yet the evidence in front of him suggested otherwise. Luther asked the sheriff if he was suggesting that Luther had hallucinated the entire experience. The sheriff said he wasn't suggesting anything, but that they needed to figure out what was really going on. He proposed that they drive out to the location together, right now, to see what was actually there. Luther agreed immediately, eager to prove that he wasn't losing his mind. They left the office together, Luther following the sheriff's patrol car in his truck as they retraced the route he'd taken earlier that evening. The drive seemed to take longer than Luther remembered, the darkness pressing in from all sides as they wound through the forest. He found himself watching his odometer obsessively, trying to calculate the exact distance from Millridge to the gas station. After about 40 minutes of driving, the sheriff's brake lights flashed and he pulled over to the side of the road. Luther stopped behind him and climbed down from his cab. The sheriff was standing at the edge of the road, shining a powerful flashlight into the trees. Luther joined him and immediately saw what the beam was illuminating: the concrete foundation of a long-destroyed building, surrounded by overgrown vegetation and debris. There were no pumps, no canopy, no office with a flickering fluorescent light. Just ruins that had clearly been abandoned for decades. Luther felt his legs go weak. He told the sheriff this wasn't possible, that he'd been here just hours ago, that he'd stood right there and pumped diesel into his tank. The sheriff asked how much fuel Luther had purchased. Luther checked his fuel gauge and felt his confusion deepen. The tank showed 3/4 full, which was approximately where it had been when he'd stopped at the gas station. If he'd actually filled the tank as he remembered, it should be showing full. But if he hadn't stopped at all, shouldn't the gauge be lower than it was? The sheriff walked around the ruins, his flashlight beam sweeping back and forth across the overgrown foundation. He called out to Luther, asking him to describe the interior of the building he'd entered. Luther did his best, recounting details about the shelves, the cooler, the counter, and most importantly, the bulletin board covered with photographs of trucks. The sheriff listened carefully, then asked Luther to follow him. They walked around to what would have been the back of the building, where the flashlight revealed something that made Luther's heart skip. A bulletin board, weathered and rotting, still mounted to a partially collapsed wall. And pinned to that bulletin board, protected from the elements by the overhang of the ruined structure, were dozens of photographs. Photographs of trucks. Luther approached the bulletin board slowly, almost afraid to look at it too closely. The photographs were old, their colors faded and their edges curled, but they were unmistakably the same images he'd seen earlier. 18-wheelers photographed from various angles and distances, captured without their driver's knowledge. Some of the photographs had dates written on them in faded ink, and Luther could make out years ranging from the late 1980s through the mid-1990s. The sheriff used his flashlight to illuminate one photograph in particular, a picture of a truck very similar to Luther's own rig. The image quality was poor and the angle was wrong, but there was no denying the similarity. The sheriff asked Luther if this could have been the photograph he'd seen that had made him think of his own truck. Luther wanted to say no, wanted to insist that the photographs he'd seen had been recent and clear, but looking at this faded image in the flashlight beam, he found he couldn't be certain. They spent another 20 minutes searching the ruins, but found nothing else of interest. No sign that anyone had been there recently, no indication that the building had been anything other than abandoned for the past 2 decades. The sheriff finally suggested they head back to town, and Luther agreed numbly. As they drove back toward Millridge, Luther's mind was spinning. He knew what he'd experienced, knew it had felt completely real, and yet the evidence suggested it had been some kind of hallucination or waking dream. But that didn't make sense either. He'd been well rested, hadn't been drinking or taking any medication, and had never experienced anything like this before in his life. The alternative explanation, that something genuinely inexplicable had occurred, was almost too frightening to consider. Back at the sheriff's office, Luther sat in the same chair as before while Sheriff Tullis made coffee. The sheriff seemed troubled, and when he finally spoke, his words came slowly, as if he was choosing them carefully. He told Luther that over the years there had been other reports of strange occurrences along that particular stretch of road. Drivers who claimed to have stopped at businesses that didn't exist, or to have had conversations with people who couldn't be found afterward. Most of these reports had been dismissed as the result of fatigue or confusion, and the sheriff himself had never taken them very seriously. But now, with Meredith Claiborne's disappearance and Luther's experience at the non-existent gas station, he was starting to wonder if there was something more to it. He asked Luther if he believed in things that couldn't be easily explained, supernatural things. Luther said he didn't know what he believed anymore. The sheriff then shared something he'd been reluctant to mention earlier. When they'd been investigating Meredith Claiborne's house after her disappearance, they'd found a journal hidden in a locked drawer. The journal contained entries spanning several years, and much of it was mundane stuff about her daily life and work. But there were also passages that suggested Meredith had been researching something, looking into the history of the area around Millridge with particular focus on disappearances and unsolved deaths. She'd documented cases going back more than a century, people who'd vanished without a trace while traveling through the region. She'd also written about Murphy's service station specifically, noting that the owner, a man named Gerald Murphy, had died under suspicious circumstances in 2003. The fire that destroyed the station had started in the middle of the night, and Murphy's body had been found in the burned-out office, but the autopsy had revealed he'd been dead before the fire started. Murdered, though the killer was never found. Luther asked why the sheriff was telling him all this. The answer was both simple and terrifying. Because in that journal, Meredith Claiborne had written about believing that something was using the ruins of Murphy's service station as a lure, appearing to travelers as a functioning business in order to draw them in. She'd theorized that whatever this thing was, it had been responsible for numerous disappearances over the years, and that it might have been connected to Murphy's death as well. The sheriff had dismissed this as paranoid fantasy when he'd first read it, but after Luther's experience tonight, he wasn't so sure anymore. He asked Luther if he'd seen anyone else at the gas station besides the man behind the counter. Luther thought back and realized that no, the place had been completely empty except for the two of them. On a Friday evening, on a road that presumably saw at least some traffic, there had been no other customers at all. The sheriff suggested that Luther stay in town for the night rather than continuing on to make his delivery. The general store wouldn't be open until morning anyway, and the sheriff wanted to ask Luther some more questions after they'd both had time to think about everything. Luther agreed, partly because he was exhausted, but mostly because the thought of driving back past those ruins in the dark terrified him. The sheriff recommended a small motel on the edge of town, and Luther thanked him before heading back to his truck. As he drove the short distance to the motel, he couldn't stop thinking about those photographs on the bulletin board. Even if they were decades old, someone had taken them. Someone had stood at that gas station and documented every truck that passed by, collecting images with an obsessive dedication that Luther found deeply disturbing. The motel was exactly what Luther expected. A single-story building with about a dozen rooms and a blinking vacancy sign. The elderly woman at the front desk barely looked at him as she took his cash and handed him a key. His room was small and clean enough, with a bed that sagged in the middle and a television that only received 3 channels. Luther locked the door, wedged a chair under the handle for extra security, and sat on the bed. He pulled out his phone and tried to search for information about Murphy's service station, but the cell signal was too weak to load anything. He considered calling his dispatcher to explain why he'd be late with the delivery, but it was after 11 and he decided it could wait until morning. Instead, he lay back on the bed fully clothed and stared at the water-stained ceiling, trying to make sense of everything that had happened. Sleep came eventually, though it was troubled and full of half-remembered dreams. Luther found himself back at the gas station. But this time when he entered the office, Meredith Claiborne was there instead of the gray-haired man. She was pinning photographs to the bulletin board, each image showing a different truck driver, and when she turned to look at Luther, her eyes were empty black voids. She opened her mouth to speak, but instead of words, a cloud of flies emerged, buzzing and swarming around Luther's head. He tried to run, but his legs wouldn't move, and he could feel the flies landing on his face, crawling into his mouth and nose. He woke with a gasp, his heart pounding and his shirt soaked with sweat. The room was still dark, and according to his phone, it was only 4 a.m. Luther knew he wouldn't be able to fall back asleep, so he got up and took a long shower, letting the hot water wash away the lingering unease from his nightmare. By the time he was dressed and ready, the sky outside was beginning to lighten with the approach of dawn. He checked out of the motel and drove his truck to a diner he'd noticed the night before, one of those classic American breakfast places with vinyl booths and a laminated menu that probably hadn't changed since the 1980s. The place was empty, except for a waitress who looked like she'd been working there for approximately forever. She poured him coffee without asking and took his order for eggs and toast with mechanical efficiency. Luther sat in a booth by the window and watched as Millridge slowly came to life. People emerged from their houses and drove past on their way to wherever they needed to be. Everything looked completely normal and ordinary, and yet Luther couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with this place. Around 7, Sheriff Tullis entered the diner and slid into the booth across from Luther. The sheriff looked like he hadn't slept much either, with dark circles under his eyes and a general air of exhaustion. He ordered coffee and waited until the waitress was out of earshot before speaking. He told Luther that he'd spent most of the night reviewing old case files and reading through Meredith Claiborne's journal more carefully. What he'd found had disturbed him greatly. Over the past 40 years, there had been more than a dozen cases of people disappearing along the road where Murphy's service station had been located. Most had been truck drivers, but there were also a few hitchhikers and at least 2 families traveling through the area. In each case, the victims had simply vanished without a trace, their vehicles sometimes found abandoned at the side of the road, sometimes never found at all. The cases had never been connected because they'd occurred sporadically over such a long period of time, and because there was no physical evidence linking them together. But Meredith Claiborne had connected them. She'd created a timeline documenting every disappearance, every strange report, every unexplained death in the region. And at the center of it all was Murphy's service station. According to her research, the station had been built in 1967 on land that had previously been the site of a logging camp. That camp had been the location of a brutal murder in 1952, when a worker had killed 3 of his colleagues before disappearing into the wilderness. His body had never been found, and the logging camp had been abandoned shortly afterward. Meredith had theorized that there was something about that specific location, some quality that attracted violence and tragedy. She'd believed that Murphy's death in 2003 hadn't been random, but rather part of a pattern that stretched back decades, and she'd been trying to prove it when she disappeared. Luther asked the sheriff what he thought had happened to Meredith. The sheriff was quiet for a long moment, stirring his coffee even though he hadn't added anything to it. Finally, he admitted that he thought Meredith had gone to Murphy's service station looking for evidence to support her theories, and that something had happened to her there. Whether it was something natural, something criminal, or something that defied explanation, he couldn't say. But he was certain that the gas station, or whatever appeared to be the gas station, was at the heart of all of this. He'd decided to organize a thorough search of the area, bringing in cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar to see if they could find any evidence of burial sites or remains. It would take a few days to arrange, but the sheriff was determined to get answers, both for Meredith's sake and for the sake of all the others who'd vanished over the years. Luther finished his breakfast and told the sheriff he needed to make his delivery and then get back on the road. He had a schedule to keep, and he'd already lost enough time. The sheriff understood, but asked Luther to stay in touch, to call if he remembered anything else about his experience at the gas station or if anything unusual happened on his drive back. Luther promised he would, though privately he'd already decided that he'd be taking a different route home, one that avoided that stretch of road entirely. He paid for his breakfast, shook the sheriff's hand, and walked out into the cold morning air. Millridge looked innocent enough in the daylight, a quiet little town where nothing much ever happened. But Luther knew better now. He understood that beneath the surface of normalcy, something dark was lurking, something that had been claiming victims for longer than anyone realized. The delivery to the general store went smoothly enough. The owner paid in cash as usual and helped Luther unload the supplies without much conversation. Luther considered warning the man about what had happened, about the gas station and the disappearances, but he decided against it. What would he say that wouldn't make him sound crazy? By 9:30, he was back on the road, heading east toward the Billings on a different route than the one he'd taken coming in. The highway he chose was busier and better maintained, and though it added an extra hour to his journey, Luther didn't care. He would gladly pay that price to avoid ever seeing Murphy's service station again, whether it existed or not. The drive back to Billings should have been uneventful, and for the first 2 hours it was. Luther kept the radio off, preferring silence as he processed everything that had happened in the past 24 hours. The highway stretched ahead of him, busy enough with mid-morning traffic that he felt a measure of comfort in not being alone on the road. Every few miles he'd pass another truck or be passed by one, and each time he felt a small sense of relief. There was safety in numbers, he'd decided, even if that safety was an illusion. He kept checking his mirrors obsessively, though he couldn't have said what he was looking for. Some part of him expected to see that gray-haired man from the gas station following him, though that made no rational sense. The man hadn't existed, or at least the gas station hadn't existed, which meant the man probably hadn't either. Unless he had existed in some way that Luther didn't understand and didn't want to think about too carefully. Around noon, Luther's phone rang. It was Sheriff Tullis, and the man's voice sounded strained even through the poor cell connection. The sheriff asked if Luther was still in the area, or if he'd already left Millridge. Luther told him he was about 2 hours east, well on his way back to Billings. There was a pause, and then the sheriff asked Luther if he'd noticed anything unusual on his drive, anyone following him or any vehicles that seemed to be pacing him. Luther's grip tightened on the steering wheel. He asked why the sheriff wanted to know, and the answer made his blood run cold. A woman had come into the sheriff's office about an hour ago, claiming to be Meredith Claiborne. The sheriff had been shocked to see her alive, and his first questions had been about where she'd been and what had happened to her. But the woman's answers had been strange, vague, and contradictory. She'd claimed she'd been visiting family in another state, even though the sheriff knew for a fact that Meredith had no living family. When he'd pressed her for details, she'd become agitated and then simply walked out of the office. Luther asked if the sheriff had tried to stop her, and Tullis explained that he'd followed her outside, but by the time he reached the street, she'd vanished, just disappeared into thin air, despite the fact that there was nowhere she could have gone in the few seconds it took him to get through the door. The sheriff had searched the immediate area and questioned several people who'd been on the street at the time, but nobody had seen which direction she'd gone. It was as if she'd never been there at all. Except for one thing. She'd left behind a photograph on the sheriff's desk. The photograph showed Luther's truck, taken from an angle that suggested it had been shot while Luther was stopped at a traffic light or stop sign. The sheriff had immediately tried to call Luther to warn him, though he wasn't entirely sure what he was warning him about. All he knew was that whatever was happening in Millridge, whatever had taken Meredith Claiborne and all those other people over the years, it seemed to have taken an interest in Luther. Luther's first instinct was to dismiss this as paranoia or coincidence, but he couldn't quite manage it. He asked the sheriff to describe the woman who'd claimed to be Meredith Claiborne. The description matched the photograph Luther had seen the night before. Dark hair, sharp features, intelligent eyes. But there was one detail the sheriff mentioned that hadn't been in the photograph. The woman's hands had been stained with what looked like old oil or grease, the kind that gets ground into your skin after working on an engine and never quite washes out completely. And when she'd walked, the sheriff had noticed she was leaving faint footprints on the floor, even though it hadn't rained and her shoes appeared dry. The footprints had looked dark, almost black, and they'd smelled of ash. By the time the sheriff had thought to examine them more closely, they'd faded away entirely, as if they'd never existed. Luther thanked the sheriff for the warning and promised to be careful, though he had no idea what being careful meant in this context. After they hung up, Luther found himself watching the road with renewed paranoia. Every car that pulled up behind him seemed suspicious. Every truck that passed him might contain someone or something watching him. He told himself he was being irrational, that there was no way anyone or anything could be following him on a busy highway in broad daylight, but the feeling persisted. Around 1 o'clock, he stopped at a rest area to use the bathroom and stretch his legs. The parking lot was full of vehicles, families, and solo travelers taking breaks from their journeys, and the normalcy of it all should have been comforting. Instead, Luther found himself studying every person he passed, looking for signs of something wrong, something off. In the bathroom, he splashed cold water on his face and stared at his reflection in the mirror. He looked exhausted, with bloodshot eyes and skin that seemed paler than usual. He'd been driving professionally for more than 2 decades, and in all that time he'd never experienced anything like the past 24 hours. He'd heard stories from other truckers, of course, tales of strange encounters on lonely roads and unexplained phenomena witnessed in the dark hours before dawn. He'd always dismissed these stories as the products of fatigue and imagination, the kind of thing that happened when you spent too many hours alone with nothing but your thoughts for company. Now, he wasn't so sure. Now he was starting to understand that there were things in the world that couldn't be easily explained or rationalized away, and that some roads went to places that weren't marked on any map. When Luther returned to his truck, he found something that made his heart skip. Tucked under his windshield wiper was a photograph. It showed his truck parked at this very rest area, taken from somewhere in the tree line that bordered the parking lot. The angle and quality suggested it had been shot within the past few minutes while Luther was inside the building. He grabbed the photograph and looked around wildly, scanning the parking lot and the surrounding woods for any sign of who might have taken it. There were dozens of people visible, but none of them seemed to be paying any attention to him. No one was holding a camera or acting suspicious. Luther climbed into his cab and locked the doors, his hands shaking as he examined the photograph more closely. It was printed on the same type of old-fashioned photo paper as the images he'd seen on the bulletin board at Murphy's service station, with slightly faded colors and a grainy quality that suggested it had been developed in a darkroom rather than printed digitally. Luther started his engine and pulled out of the rest area as quickly as he could safely manage, merging back onto the highway with his heart pounding. He considered calling Sheriff Tullis back, but what would he say? That someone had taken his picture at a public rest stop? That wasn't a crime, and without more evidence, it just made him sound paranoid. Instead, he focused on putting as much distance as possible between himself and Millridge, pushing his truck as fast as he dared without risking a speeding ticket. The miles rolled by slowly, each one feeling like it took forever. Luther found himself checking his mirrors constantly, looking for any vehicle that might be following him, but the traffic behind him was constantly changing. Cars and trucks would appear, follow him for a few miles, then exit or speed past. There was no way to tell if any of them were actually following him or just traveling in the same direction. Around 3 p.m, Luther's phone rang again. This time it was his dispatcher, wanting to know why he hadn't checked in after completing his delivery. Luther apologized and gave a vague explanation about cell phone problems and losing track of time. The dispatcher accepted this without question and gave Luther his next assignment: a pickup in Great Falls tomorrow morning, followed by a delivery to Spokane. Luther wrote down the details mechanically, barely processing the information. All he wanted was to get home to Billings, lock himself in his apartment, and try to forget everything that had happened. But even as he had that thought, he knew it wouldn't be that simple. Whatever had happened at Murphy's service station, whatever had taken an interest in him, wasn't going to just let him walk away. He could feel it somehow, a certainty that settled in his gut like a stone. The last hour of the drive was torture. Luther's exhaustion was catching up with him, and he had to fight to keep his eyes open. Several times he caught himself drifting toward the shoulder and had to jerk the wheel to correct his course. He considered pulling over to rest, but the thought of stopping anywhere, even in broad daylight, terrified him. So he pushed on, chugging coffee from a thermos that had long since gone cold and rolling down his window to let the frigid air blast him in the face. When the Billings city limits sign finally appeared, Luther felt a wave of relief so intense it almost made him dizzy. He was home, or as close to home as he ever got these days. His apartment was in a complex on the east side of town, a generic 2-bedroom unit that he'd barely bothered to furnish. He spent so little time there that it had never seemed worth the effort to make it feel like a real home. Luther parked his truck in the lot of the trucking company he contracted with, transferred his personal belongings to his car, and drove to his apartment. The sun was setting by the time he pulled into his parking spot, casting long shadows across the complex. He grabbed his bag from the back seat and hurried to his door, fumbling with his keys in his haste to get inside. Once he was safely in his apartment with the door locked and the deadbolt thrown, he finally allowed himself to breathe. He dropped his bag on the floor and collapsed onto his couch, staring at the ceiling and trying to process everything that had happened. Part of him wanted to convince himself it had all been some kind of hallucination or stress-induced breakdown. But the photograph tucked in his jacket pocket was real as the memory of that gray-haired man watching him from behind the counter of a gas station that didn't exist. Luther spent the evening trying to distract himself with television and the internet, but nothing held his attention for long. He kept thinking about Meredith Claiborne and her journal full of disappearances and unexplained deaths. He thought about the woman who'd claimed to be her, walking into Sheriff Tullis's office and then vanishing into thin air. He thought about all those photographs on the bulletin board, decades' worth of trucks documented by someone or something with an obsessive need to record every vehicle that passed by. Around midnight, unable to sleep, Luther opened his laptop and started searching for information about Murphy's service station. There wasn't much to find, just a few mentions in local news archives about the fire that had destroyed it in 2003 and the death of its owner, Gerald Murphy. The fire had been ruled suspicious, but no charges were ever filed. Murphy's murder remained unsolved. Luther dug deeper, searching for information about the disappearances Meredith had documented. He found scattered references in old newspapers and missing person databases, but nothing that connected them together. A trucker named Raymond Voss who'd vanished in 1907 while traveling through Montana. A family of 4 who'd disappeared in 93, their car found abandoned on a county road with the engine still running. A hitchhiker in 2001, last seen accepting a ride from an unidentified truck driver. The cases went back decades, all of them clustered around that same stretch of road where Murphy's service station had once stood. Luther created a timeline in a notebook, writing down every case he could find along with any relevant details. By 3 a.m, he had documented 17 disappearances spanning from 1967 to Meredith Claiborne in the present day. 17 people who'd gone missing without a trace, their fates unknown, and their cases gradually forgotten as the years passed. The pattern was clear once Luther laid it all out. Most of the disappearances occurred in the fall and winter months, when darkness came early and the roads were less traveled. Most of the victims were alone, either driving solo or hitchhiking without companions. And all of them had last been seen somewhere near that cursed piece of land where Murphy's service station had been built. Luther stared at his timeline until his eyes burned and his vision blurred. He thought about adding his own name to the list, creating an entry for himself with today's date and a question mark for the outcome. But he was still here, still alive, which meant he'd somehow escaped whatever fate had claimed the others. Or maybe he hadn't escaped at all. Maybe whatever was happening was still in progress, and the photograph under his windshield wiper had been a message that this wasn't over yet. Luther finally fell asleep on his couch around 4 a.m, still fully clothed and with his laptop open on the coffee table. His dreams were fragmented and disturbing, full of images of burning buildings and bulletin boards covered with photographs. In one dream, he was standing at the ruins of Murphy's service station, watching as people emerged from the forest one by one. They were all that disappeared, the 17 victims he'd documented plus dozens more he'd never heard of. They stood in a circle around him, silent and staring, and Luther understood somehow that they were waiting for him to join them. He tried to run, but his legs wouldn't move, and the circle of people slowly tightened, drawing closer and closer until he could see that their eyes were empty sockets and their mouths were full of ash. He woke with a gasp, his heart hammering, and his shirt soaked with sweat. The apartment was still dark, and according to his phone it was only 6 a.m. Luther took a long shower and forced himself to eat something, though he had no appetite. He had to be in Great Falls by noon to pick up his next load, which meant he needed to get back on the road soon. The thought of driving filled him with dread, but he couldn't afford to skip assignments. He was an independent contractor, and missing deliveries meant not getting paid. More than that, it meant developing a reputation as unreliable, and in the trucking business, reputation was everything. So, Luther packed a fresh bag, made sure he had all his paperwork in order, and headed back to the lot where his truck was parked. The morning was cold and gray, with a sky full of clouds that threatened rain or possibly snow. Luther did his pre-trip inspection mechanically, checking tires and lights and fluid levels without really thinking about what he was doing. Everything seemed to be in order, and there were no mysterious photographs tucked under his wipers or any other signs that something was wrong. The drive to Great Falls should have taken about 3 hours, and for most of that time, Luther kept waiting for something to happen. He watched for cars that might be following him, studied every rest area and gas station he passed for signs of anything unusual, and kept his phone close in case Sheriff Tullis called with more disturbing news from Millridge. But nothing happened. The highway was busy with morning traffic. The weather held despite the threatening clouds, and Luther reached Great Falls without incident. The pickup location was a warehouse on the industrial side of town, and the loading crew had his freight ready to go. They were quick and professional, and within an hour Luther was back on the road with a trailer full of building materials headed for Spokane. He should have felt relieved that everything was going smoothly, but instead, the normalcy of it all felt wrong somehow, like the calm before a storm. Luther had been driving for about 2 hours when he noticed a truck that seemed to be pacing him. It was an older model Peterbilt, painted a faded blue, and it had been hanging back about a quarter mile behind him for the past 30 minutes. Luther tried changing lanes, speeding up, slowing down, but the Peterbilt matched his every move. He couldn't see the driver clearly through the windshield, just a vague silhouette that might have been male or female, young or old. Luther told himself he was being paranoid, that this was just another trucker traveling in the same direction at the same speed. But something about the way the Peterbilt maintained its distance, never getting closer but never falling behind, set off alarm bells in his head. He grabbed his CB radio and switched to channel 19, the frequency most truckers monitored. He called out a general greeting and asked if anyone wanted to chat to pass the time. Several voices responded, including one that identified himself as driving a blue Peterbilt. Luther asked the Peterbilt driver where he was headed, and the voice said Spokane, same as Luther. They chatted for a few minutes about nothing in particular. Weather and road conditions, and complaints about fuel prices. The voice sounded completely normal, just another trucker doing his job and looking for conversation to break up the monotony. But there was something about it that bothered Luther, something he couldn't quite identify. The voice was friendly enough, but there was an odd flatness to it, as if the person was reading from a script rather than speaking naturally. Luther asked the Peterbilt driver where he'd started his day, and there was a pause before the answer came. Millridge. Luther's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He asked what the driver had been doing in Millridge, and the voice said he'd made a delivery there, same as Luther. Luther hadn't mentioned anything about Millridge, hadn't said where he'd been or what he'd been doing. He reached for the CB handset again, intending to ask how the driver knew about his delivery, but before he could speak, the voice came through again. The voice said that Luther had made quite an impression in Millridge, that people there were still talking about him. The sheriff especially, who'd been very interested in Luther's story about the gas station. Luther felt his mouth go dry. He asked who this was, what they wanted from him, but the voice just laughed. It was a strange laugh, too high-pitched and lasting too long, and it made Luther think of the voice he'd heard in his dream, the one coming from mouths full of ash. The voice said that Luther had been marked, that he'd been chosen, and that it was too late to run now. He'd stopped at the gas station, paid his money, pumped his fuel, and in doing so had entered into an agreement he didn't understand. The voice said Luther would see Murphy's service station again, whether he wanted to or not, and next time he wouldn't be leaving. Then the CB went silent, cutting off in the middle of the voice speaking, and when Luther looked in his mirror, the blue Peterbilt was gone. Luther pulled over at the next rest area, his heart racing and his hands shaking so badly he could barely steer. He parked in a space far from any other vehicles and sat in his cab with the doors locked, trying to calm down. He told himself that this was just someone playing a prank, that they'd somehow found out about what happened in Millridge and decided to mess with him. But that explanation didn't hold up to scrutiny. How would anyone know about his experience at the gas station? The only people who knew were Sheriff Tullis and Luther himself, and he couldn't imagine the sheriff telling random truckers about it. Luther grabbed his phone and called the sheriff's office, but the call went straight to voicemail. He left a message asking the sheriff to call him back as soon as possible, then sat and waited. Around him, the rest area was busy with travelers coming and going, families and solo drivers and truckers like himself, all of them going about their business as if nothing was wrong. Luther envied them their ignorance, their ability to move through the world without knowing what lurked in the shadows. An hour passed with no return call from Sheriff Tullis. Luther tried again and got the same result, straight to voicemail. He considered calling the Millridge Sheriff's Office directly instead of the sheriff's personal cell phone, but he wasn't sure what he'd say. That a voice on the CB radio had threatened him, that he thought something supernatural was stalking him. They'd probably think he was crazy, and maybe he was. Maybe everything that had happened in the past 2 days was the result of stress and sleep deprivation, his mind creating threats that didn't actually exist. But the photographs were real, the one from Murphy's service station and the one from the rest area yesterday. Those weren't hallucinations. Someone had taken those pictures and left them for Luther to find, which meant someone was watching him, following him, documenting his movements just like they'd documented all those other trucks on the bulletin board decades ago. Luther finally forced himself to get back on the road. He had a delivery to make and he was already behind schedule. The remaining drive to Spokane passed in a haze of exhaustion and paranoia. Luther kept the CB radio on, but didn't hear the voice again. He watched his mirrors obsessively but didn't see the blue Peterbilt or any other vehicle that seemed to be following him. By the time he reached the delivery location in Spokane, it was after dark, and Luther felt like he'd aged 10 years in the past 2 days. The warehouse crew unloaded his trailer efficiently, and Luther signed the paperwork in a daze. His dispatcher called to give him his next assignment, but Luther told him he needed a few days off for personal reasons. The dispatcher wasn't happy about it, but Luther's record was good enough that he agreed without too much argument. Luther found a truck stop hotel on the edge of Spokane and checked in, paying cash for a room he hoped he'd actually be safe in. The truck stop hotel was one of those places designed specifically for drivers like Luther, with oversized parking spaces and rooms that smelled of diesel fuel and stale cigarettes despite the no smoking signs. Luther's room was on the 2nd floor, overlooking the parking lot where his truck sat among dozens of others. He stood at the window for a long time, studying the vehicles below, looking for the blue Peterbilt or any other truck that seemed out of place. Everything looked normal, just a collection of rigs in various states of wear, their drivers either sleeping in their cabs or renting rooms like Luther had. He closed the curtains eventually and sat on the bed, too wired to sleep despite his exhaustion. His phone showed several missed calls from Sheriff Tullis, all of them coming in during the past hour, while Luther had been checking in and getting settled. He called back immediately and the sheriff answered on the first ring. Sheriff Tullis sounded shaken in a way he hadn't before, his voice tight with barely controlled fear. He asked Luther where he was and whether he was somewhere safe. Luther told him about the truck stop hotel in Spokane and asked what had happened. The sheriff was quiet for a moment, and Luther could hear him breathing heavily on the other end of the line. When he finally spoke, his words came out in a rush, as if he needed to say them quickly before he lost his nerve. After the woman, claiming to be Meredith Claiborne, had disappeared from his office, the sheriff had decided to drive out to her house on the edge of town. He'd been there dozens of times during the investigation into her disappearance, but something had drawn him back, a feeling he couldn't quite explain that he needed to look one more time. The house had been locked up since Meredith vanished, the windows dark and the yard overgrown. The sheriff had let himself in with the key the landlord had provided months ago, and what he'd found inside had nearly made him turn around and run. The house was exactly as it had been when Meredith disappeared, with all her furniture and belongings still in place, covered now with a thick layer of dust. But in the living room, spread across the floor in a pattern that must have taken hours to arrange, were photographs. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, all showing the same subject: Luther's truck. The images showed Luther's rig from every conceivable angle and distance, taken at different times of day and in different locations. Some were clearly shot while Luther was driving, the truck captured in motion on various highways. Others showed the truck parked at rest areas, gas stations, and delivery locations. A few appeared to have been taken from inside Luther's cab, showing the view through his windshield or the interior of the sleeper berth behind the driver's seat. The sheriff had recognized Luther's truck immediately from the company name painted on the side, and the realization of what he was looking at had made his blood run cold. Luther felt his stomach drop as the sheriff described the scene. He asked how someone could have taken photographs from inside his truck without him knowing, and the sheriff said he had no answer to that question. What made it even more disturbing was that many of the photographs appeared to be old, printed on the same type of vintage photo paper as the images from Murphy's service station. Some were dated, with handwritten notations in the margins indicating when and where they'd been taken. The dates went back years, long before Luther had ever driven through Millridge or anywhere near that part of Montana. It was as if someone had been documenting his movements for his entire career as a trucker, compiling a comprehensive record of everywhere he'd been and everything he'd done. The sheriff had taken photos of the display with his phone and said he'd email them to Luther so he could see for himself. He'd also called in a forensics team to process the scene, though he wasn't sure what they'd be able to find beyond the photographs themselves. Luther asked if the sheriff had any idea who was behind this, whether it was connected to whoever had killed Gerald Murphy back in 2003. The sheriff said he'd been thinking about that, trying to make sense of the timeline and the patterns. Gerald Murphy had owned and operated the gas station from 1967 until his death in 2003, a span of 36 years. During that time, at least a dozen people had disappeared along that stretch of road, their cases never solved and eventually forgotten. Murphy had been found dead in his office with his throat cut, and the killer had set fire to the building to cover up the crime. The authorities at the time had assumed it was a robbery gone wrong, but the sheriff now believed it had been something else entirely. He thought Murphy might have been documenting the trucks that passed by his station, collecting photographs for reasons unknown, and that eventually someone or something had put a stop to it. The fire had destroyed most of the records, but the bulletin board outside had survived, protected from the flames by its location away from the main building. The sheriff's theory was that whatever had driven Murphy to document those trucks had continued after his death, finding new ways to collect images and new victims to prey upon. Meredith Claiborne had stumbled onto this pattern during her research, and her investigation had drawn the attention of whatever force was behind it all. She'd disappeared, and now someone or something was using her house as a base of operations, filling it with photographs of Luther's truck, just as Murphy had once filled his bulletin board with images of other vehicles. The sheriff admitted he didn't know if what they were dealing with was a human predator or something else, something that defied rational explanation. He'd spent his entire career dealing with crimes that made sense, that followed logical patterns and could be solved through evidence and deduction. But this was different. This felt like stepping into territory where normal rules didn't apply and the very fabric of reality seemed thin and unstable. Luther thanked the sheriff for the warning and promised to be careful, though he still had no clear idea what being careful meant in this situation. After they hung up, Luther sat on the bed and waited for the email with the photographs. It arrived about 10 minutes later, and Luther's hands were shaking as he opened the attachment on his phone. The images the sheriff had taken showed exactly what he'd described: a living room floor covered with hundreds of photographs, all arranged in neat rows that stretched from wall to wall. Luther zoomed in on individual photos, trying to see the details, and what he saw made him feel sick. There were pictures of him climbing into his truck, pictures of him at gas pumps, pictures of him eating in diners and sleeping in rest areas. There were even photographs that appeared to have been taken through his apartment window, showing him sitting on his couch or standing in his kitchen. Whoever had compiled this collection had been watching him for years, documenting every aspect of his life with an obsessive attention to detail that felt almost worshipful in its intensity. Luther set his phone down and tried to think clearly despite the fear that was threatening to overwhelm him. He'd been targeted for some reason, marked for attention by something that had been operating for decades, claiming victims and leaving no trace of its activities beyond cryptic photographs and unsolved disappearances. The question was why? What made him different from any other trucker on the road? He'd never met Gerald Murphy, had never even heard of the man until a few days ago. He'd never been to Millridge before 8 months ago when he started making deliveries there. There was no obvious connection between himself and the other victims, no common thread that might explain why he'd been chosen, unless it wasn't about who he was, but rather something he'd done. Some action that had marked him for attention without his knowledge or understanding. Luther thought back to his first trip to Millridge, trying to remember if anything unusual had happened. It had been a routine delivery, nothing memorable about it. He'd driven up from Billings, dropped off supplies at the general store, and driven back. He hadn't stopped at any gas stations along the way because he'd filled his tank before leaving. He hadn't talked to anyone except the store owner, and their conversation had been limited to business. There was nothing in that first trip that should have drawn attention to him, nothing that would explain why someone would start photographing him obsessively from that point forward. But the photographs the sheriff had found were dated going back years before that first delivery, which meant Luther had been on someone's radar long before he ever drove through Millridge. The thought was terrifying because it suggested that whatever was happening had been set in motion years ago, a slow-moving trap that Luther had walked into without ever realizing he was in danger. Sleep was impossible. Luther spent the night pacing his small hotel room, jumping at every sound from the hallway or parking lot below. Several times he pulled back the curtain to check on his truck, making sure it was still there and that nobody was tampering with it. Around 3 a.m, he saw a figure walking through the parking lot, moving between the trucks with purpose. Luther watched as the figure approached his rig and stopped beside it, looking up at the hotel as if trying to determine which room Luther was in. The figure was too far away and the lighting too poor for Luther to make out any details, but something about the way it moved seemed wrong, mechanical, and jerky like a puppet being manipulated by an inexperienced handler. Luther grabbed his phone to call the police, but by the time he'd unlocked it and opened the dialer, the figure had vanished. He spent the next hour watching the parking lot, but the figure didn't reappear. When morning finally came, Luther felt like he'd been awake for days. He checked out of the hotel and went through his pre-trip inspection with paranoid thoroughness, looking for any signs that someone had tampered with his truck during the night. Everything seemed normal, all the seals intact and no obvious damage or modifications. He climbed into the cab and sat there for a few minutes, trying to decide what to do next. His dispatcher had given him a few days off, which meant he didn't have any immediate obligations. He could drive back to Billings and lock himself in his apartment, but that felt like admitting defeat. The photographs in Meredith Claiborne's house had shown images taken through his apartment windows, which meant whoever was watching him knew where he lived. There was nowhere he could hide that would be truly safe. The alternative was to confront whatever was happening, to go back to Millridge and Murphy's service station and try to understand what he was dealing with. Luther knew this was probably a terrible idea, possibly even suicidal. Every horror movie he'd ever seen had taught him that going back to the source of danger was a guaranteed way to end up dead. But he also knew he couldn't live like this, constantly looking over his shoulder and waiting for something terrible to happen. If he was going to be a victim, he wanted to face it head-on rather than spending the rest of his life running. He called Sheriff Tullis and told him he was coming back to Millridge. The sheriff tried to talk him out of it, saying it was too dangerous and that Luther should stay as far away as possible. But Luther was insistent. He told the sheriff he needed to see Murphy's service station again, needed to understand what had happened to him there and why he'd been chosen. The sheriff finally agreed, but only on the condition that he'd be there to meet Luther when he arrived. They arranged to meet at the sheriff's office in Millridge that afternoon. The drive back to Montana felt longer than it should have, every mile stretching out as Luther's anxiety grew. He kept expecting something to happen, for the blue Peterbilt to appear in his mirrors, or for that voice to come through on the CB radio. But the highway remained normal, busy with traffic and free of any obvious threats. Luther tried to convince himself that this was a good sign, that maybe whatever had been stalking him had lost interest or moved on to another victim, but he knew that was wishful thinking. Things like this didn't just go away. They waited and watched and struck when you least expected it, which meant Luther needed to be ready for anything. He'd stopped at a sporting goods store in Spokane before leaving and purchased a hunting knife with a 6-inch blade, which he now kept within easy reach on the seat beside him. He wasn't sure what good a knife would do against whatever he was dealing with, but having it made him feel slightly less helpless. Luther reached Millridge around 2 in the afternoon, the town looking exactly as it had a few days ago when he'd driven through. Nothing had changed on the surface, but Luther could feel the difference. There was a tension in the air, a sense of something waiting and watching. He parked his truck at the sheriff's office and went inside to find Sheriff Tullis sitting at his desk, looking like he hadn't slept any better than Luther had. The sheriff had organized a small team to accompany them to Murphy's service station. Himself, Luther, and a deputy named Marcus who looked young enough to still be in high school. The sheriff had also brought a camera to document whatever they found, along with flashlights and a first aid kit. He asked Luther one more time if he was sure about this, and Luther nodded. He was sure, or as sure as he could be about something that made absolutely no rational sense. They took the sheriff's patrol car, leaving Luther's truck parked at the office. The drive to the ruins of Murphy's service station took about 40 minutes, following the same route Luther had taken a few nights ago. In the daylight, the landscape looked less threatening, just miles of pine forest and rolling hills under a gray sky. But Luther knew appearances were deceiving. Something malevolent lived in these woods, something that had been claiming victims for decades and showed no signs of stopping. When they reached the spot where the gas station had once stood, the sheriff pulled over and they all got out. The ruins looked exactly as they had the last time Luther had seen them. A concrete foundation overgrown with weeds, a few pieces of twisted metal that might have been pump housings, and the partially collapsed wall with the bulletin board still attached. The bulletin board was empty now, all the photographs gone, removed by someone or something between Luther's last visit and today. The sheriff documented everything with his camera, taking wide shots of the entire site and close-ups of specific details. Luther walked around the perimeter, trying to remember exactly where the office had been when he'd visited it as a functioning gas station. He thought it had been roughly where the concrete foundation was now, but it was hard to be certain. His memory of that night was already starting to blur, taking on a dreamlike quality that made him question whether it had really happened at all. But he knew it had been real. The fuel gauge on his truck might not have changed, but the experience had been real in every way that mattered. He'd walked into that office, seen those photographs, paid cash for fuel that he'd never actually received. And in doing so, he'd somehow marked himself for attention by whatever force controlled this place. Luther was standing at the edge of the ruins, staring into the forest beyond, when he noticed something that made his heart skip. About 50 yards into the trees, barely visible through the dense undergrowth, was a structure. It looked like a small shed or cabin, built from weathered wood and partially hidden by the foliage. Luther called out to the sheriff and pointed toward the structure. None of them had noticed it before because the angle had been wrong, but from where Luther was standing now he could see it clearly. The sheriff and his deputy joined Luther, and together they made their way through the undergrowth toward the building. As they got closer, Luther could see that it was indeed a cabin, though calling it that might have been generous. It was more like a shack, roughly 10 feet by 10 feet with a single door and no windows. The wood was old and rotting, covered in moss and lichen, and the whole structure tilted at a precarious angle as if it might collapse at any moment. The sheriff approached the door carefully, his hand on the gun at his hip. He tried the handle and found it unlocked, the door swinging open with a creak that echoed through the quiet forest. Inside, the cabin was dark and smelled of decay and something else, something chemical that Luther couldn't quite identify. The sheriff shone his flashlight inside, illuminating a space that was empty except for a single object sitting in the center of the floor. A camera. It was an old Polaroid, the kind that produced instant photographs, and it looked like it had been sitting there for years. The sheriff photographed the camera from multiple angles before carefully picking it up. There was film loaded inside, the counter showing that several shots had already been taken. The sheriff ejected the film cartridge and handed it to his deputy, then used his flashlight to examine the rest of the cabin more closely. On the walls, barely visible in the dim light, were marks. They looked like they'd been carved into the wood with a knife or other sharp implement, forming patterns that Luther couldn't quite make sense of. The sheriff photographed these as well, moving around the small space to capture every detail. Luther stood in the doorway, reluctant to enter the cabin. There was something wrong about this place, something that made his skin crawl and his instincts scream at him to run. He could feel a presence here, not exactly hostile, but not welcoming either, watching and waiting to see what they would do. The sheriff seemed to feel it too because he finished his documentation quickly and backed out of the cabin, clearly eager to leave. They stood outside for a moment, catching their breath and trying to process what they'd found. The deputy asked if they should call in more resources, maybe get a forensics team out here to process the cabin properly. The sheriff agreed, but said they needed to finish their initial survey first. They spent another hour searching the area around Murphy's service station, looking for any other structures or evidence of what might have happened here. They found nothing else of interest, just more forest and the occasional piece of rusted metal or broken glass that might have been left over from the gas station's operation. As the afternoon wore on and the sky grew darker with approaching weather, the sheriff decided they'd done enough for one day. They made their way back to the patrol car, and Luther felt a sense of relief when they finally drove away from the ruins. Whatever was happening at Murphy's service station, whatever force had been documenting trucks and claiming victims for decades, it had felt stronger there, more concentrated, like they'd been standing at the center of something vast and malevolent, something that extended far beyond that small patch of forest. Back at the sheriff's office, they reviewed the photographs the sheriff had taken, comparing them to the images Meredith Claiborne had collected in her journal. The patterns carved into the cabin walls matched symbols Meredith had sketched. strange, geometric designs that didn't correspond to any language or system the sheriff recognized. Meredith's notes suggested she'd believed these symbols were some kind of map or guide, directions to something she'd been trying to find. But what that something was, she'd never clearly explained. Her journal entries became increasingly cryptic and disjointed toward the end, as if her obsession with the mystery had begun to affect her mental state. The last entry was dated 2 days before she disappeared, and consisted of just 3 words: "It sees everything." Luther asked the sheriff what he thought had happened to Meredith, whether she'd been killed or if she was still alive somewhere. The sheriff admitted he didn't know, but his gut told him she was gone. Whatever had claimed all those other victims over the years had claimed her too, and the woman who'd appeared in his office claiming to be Meredith had been something else, something wearing her face and using her identity. Luther asked if the sheriff believed in ghosts or spirits, or whatever you wanted to call them. The sheriff said he'd never been a religious man and had always prided himself on dealing with facts and evidence. But after everything that had happened in the past few days, he was starting to think the world was a lot stranger and more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. There were things out there that couldn't be explained by science or logic, things that operated according to rules humans didn't understand and probably weren't meant to understand. As darkness fell, Luther made a decision. He told the sheriff he wanted to spend the night at Murphy's service station, to see if whatever had appeared to him as a functioning gas station would appear again. The sheriff immediately said this was a terrible idea, that Luther would be putting himself in danger for no good reason. But Luther insisted. He explained that running hadn't worked, that hiding wasn't an option, and that the only way to end this was to confront it directly. He wanted to understand what had happened to him, why he'd been chosen, and what the connection was between the gas station and all those disappearances. The sheriff tried to argue, but Luther could see he was wavering. Finally, the sheriff agreed, but only on the condition that he'd stay there with Luther. They'd camp out in the patrol car near the ruins and wait to see what happened. Luther accepted these terms, grateful for the company even though he knew the sheriff's presence might not make much difference if things went bad. They drove back to the ruins as night fell, the forest growing dark and silent around them. The sheriff parked the patrol car in the same spot where Luther had stopped his truck a few nights ago, positioning it so they had a clear view of the ruins. They settled in to wait, the sheriff monitoring the radio, while Luther watched the darkness beyond the windshield. Hours passed slowly, marked only by the occasional burst of static from the radio or the sound of wind moving through the trees. Around midnight, Luther noticed something that made him sit up straighter. A light had appeared near the ruins, faint at first but growing brighter. The sheriff saw it too and reached for his flashlight, but Luther stopped him. He wanted to see what would happen if they just observed without interfering. The light continued to grow, and gradually Luther could make out shapes forming in the darkness. The ruins were transforming, shifting and rebuilding themselves into the structure Luther had seen before. The gas station was manifesting again, complete with pumps and canopy and the small office with its flickering fluorescent light. Luther could see the bulletin board through the window, covered once again with photographs. The sheriff was staring at the scene with his mouth open, unable to believe what he was witnessing. Luther told him to stay in the car and started to open his door, but the sheriff grabbed his arm and asked what he thought he was doing. Luther said he needed to go inside, needed to see what was waiting for him there. The sheriff said absolutely not, that whatever this was, they needed to call for backup and approach it carefully. But Luther shook off the sheriff's hand and climbed out of the car. The night air was freezing, much colder than it had been just moments before, and Luther could see his breath forming clouds in front of his face. He approached the gas station slowly, every instinct screaming at him to turn around and run, but he forced himself to keep walking, his feet crunching on gravel that shouldn't exist. The office door was exactly where he remembered it, and when he pushed it open, the bell above jangled just as it had before. Inside, the space was dimly lit and smelled of cigarettes and old coffee. Behind the counter stood the gray-haired man Luther had seen before, wearing the same flannel shirt and regarding Luther with the same flat, unreadable expression. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then the man said, in a voice that sounded like wind through dead trees, "You came back." Luther found his voice and asked what this place was, what the man wanted from him. The gray-haired man didn't answer directly. Instead, he gestured toward the bulletin board behind him and said that Luther had been chosen, marked for documentation just like all the others before him. The man explained that Murphy's service station had never really closed, that it existed in a space between what was and what might have been, collecting records of travelers who passed through. Every truck that stopped here, every person who walked through that door, became part of the collection. Their images were captured, their routes documented, their entire lives recorded in photographs that existed outside normal time and space. The man said this had been happening for decades, long before Gerald Murphy bought the property and built his gas station, and it would continue long after everyone currently living had turned to dust. Luther asked why, what the purpose of all this documentation was. The gray-haired man smiled, but there was no warmth in it. He said that some questions didn't have answers that humans could understand, that there were forces in the world that operated according to their own logic and pursued goals that were incomprehensible to mortal minds. Luther had been documented, recorded, and filed away in the great collection, and now he belonged to this place just as Meredith Claiborne belonged to it, and just as all the others before them had belonged to it. The man said Luther could leave if he wanted, could walk back to the patrol car and drive away and try to resume his normal life. But he would never truly be free because he was part of the collection now, and the collection never forgot its own. Luther backed toward the door, his heart hammering. He asked what had happened to Meredith Claiborne, where she was now. The gray-haired man gestured toward the bulletin board again, and Luther saw that one of the photographs pinned there showed Meredith standing in this very office, her expression frozen in a moment of absolute terror. The man said she'd come looking for answers, just like Luther was doing now, and she'd found them. She'd learned the truth about Murphy's service station and all the disappearances, and that knowledge had changed her in ways she couldn't have anticipated. She was part of the collection now, existing in the photographs and the spaces between, forever documented and filed away. Luther asked if that was his fate too, if he would end up trapped in a photograph like Meredith. The gray-haired man said that was up to Luther. He could accept his place in the collection willingly, or he could fight it and make things more difficult for everyone involved. Either way, the outcome would be the same. Luther turned and ran from the office, bursting out into the cold night air. Behind him, he heard the gray-haired man calling out, saying there was no point in running, that Luther would always find his way back here eventually. Luther didn't look back. He sprinted toward the patrol car where Sheriff Tullis was waiting with the engine running. Luther threw himself into the passenger seat and yelled at the sheriff to drive, to get them away from this place as quickly as possible. The sheriff didn't need to be told twice. He gunned the engine and they peeled out, gravel spraying from under the tires. In the rearview mirror, Luther could see the gas station beginning to fade, the lights growing dimmer and the structure becoming translucent. Within seconds, it had vanished completely, leaving only the ruins behind. They drove in silence for several miles before either of them spoke. Finally, the sheriff asked what had happened in there, what the gray-haired man had said. Luther recounted the conversation as best he could remember it, though the details were already becoming fuzzy in his mind. The sheriff listened without interrupting, and when Luther finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said they needed to bring in state authorities, maybe even federal agents, people with resources and expertise beyond what his small-town sheriff's office could provide. Luther agreed, though he wasn't sure what any authorities could do against something like Murphy's service station. How did you fight a place that existed between moments, that operated according to rules that defied normal reality? How did you stop something that had been claiming victims for decades and showed no signs of stopping? When they reached the sheriff's office, Luther collected his truck and prepared to leave Millridge for what he hoped would be the final time. The sheriff promised to stay in touch, to let Luther know if anything new developed or if the investigation uncovered any useful information. Luther thanked him and climbed into his cab, eager to put as much distance as possible between himself and this cursed town. As he drove away, he noticed something tucked under his windshield wiper. Another photograph. This one showed him standing in the office at Murphy's service station, captured from behind as he faced the gray-haired man. Luther's hands were raised slightly, as if in surrender or supplication, and the expression on the back of his head somehow conveyed absolute terror, even though his face wasn't visible. Luther grabbed the photograph and crumpled it up, throwing it onto the passenger seat, but even as he did so, he knew it wouldn't matter. He was part of the collection now, documented and filed away, and no amount of running would change that. Luther drove through the night, heading east toward Billings, but never quite sure if he'd actually arrive. The highway stretched ahead of him, familiar and yet somehow different, as if he was traveling through a landscape that existed slightly out of phase with normal reality. Every rest area he passed, every gas station and diner, seemed to shimmer at the edges of his vision, threatening to transform into something else. Several times he saw other trucks on the road and wondered if their drivers were part of the collection too, if they'd all been marked and documented and claimed by Murphy's service station or places like it. Maybe the whole world was full of these in-between spaces, traps disguised as ordinary locations, waiting for unsuspecting travelers to stop and become part of their collections. When Luther finally reached his apartment in Billings, dawn was breaking and he felt like he'd been awake for a week. He parked his truck and sat in the cab for a long time, watching the sun rise over the city and wondering if this was real or just another manifestation of the gas station. Eventually, he climbed out and made his way to his apartment, half expecting to find it filled with photographs like Meredith Claiborne's house had been. But everything was as he'd left it, mundane and normal and reassuringly solid. Luther locked the door behind him, checked all the windows to make sure they were secure, and collapsed onto his couch. Sleep claimed him almost immediately, pulling him down into dreams full of bulletin boards and gray-haired men and gas stations that existed everywhere and nowhere all at once. Luther never drove through that part of Montana again. He told his dispatcher he wouldn't accept any more deliveries to Millridge or anywhere within 100 miles of it, and when asked why, he gave vague excuses about bad roads and unreliable clients. He switched to routes that kept him on major highways, avoiding backroads and county routes whenever possible. He never stopped at small, independent gas stations anymore, only pulling into large truck stops affiliated with national chains. And every night before he went to sleep, he checked his truck thoroughly to make sure there were no photographs tucked under the wipers or slipped through the door handles. Sometimes he found them anyway, images of his truck taken from impossible angles, printed on that same vintage photo paper. He'd crumple them up and throw them away, but he knew they'd keep coming. The collection never forgot its own, and Luther was part of the collection now. He'd been marked and documented, and somewhere in a space that existed between what was and what might have been, his image sat on a bulletin board alongside all the others who'd made the mistake of stopping at Murphy's service station. The gray-haired man had been right about one thing. Luther would never truly be free, But he could keep driving, keep moving, and maybe if he stayed on the road long enough, the collection would forget about him and turn its attention to someone else. It was a slim hope, but it was all Luther had. So he drove on through the endless American night, watching his mirrors and waiting for the next photograph to appear, knowing that someday the collection would call him back and there would be nothing he could do but answer. Burl Henning had been hauling refrigerated goods across the southern states for 17 years, and in all that time he'd developed certain habits that kept him alive and employed. He checked his cargo every 4 hours without fail, maintained his rig like it was a living thing that needed constant care, and never, under any circumstances, drove through severe weather if he could avoid it. That last rule had saved him from more than a few close calls over the years, times when other drivers had pushed through storms and ended up jackknifed on the side of the highway, or worse. Burl had seen enough twisted metal and spilled cargo to know that no delivery was worth dying for, which was why he was currently parked at a truck stop outside Little Rock, watching the sky turn the color of a fresh bruise and listening to weather reports that grew more dire with each passing hour. The forecast called for severe thunderstorms moving through central Arkansas, with possible tornadoes and flash flooding. Burl had called his dispatcher to explain the situation, and after some back and forth about deadlines and customer expectations, they'd agreed he could wait out the worst of it before continuing north. The truck stop was crowded with other drivers who'd made the same calculation, their rigs lined up in neat rows facing the building. Burl had claimed a spot near the back of the lot, positioning his truck so he could see the highway and the approaching storm. He'd been through his share of bad weather over the years, everything from blizzards in the Dakotas to ice storms in Tennessee, but there was something about these southern thunderstorms that made him particularly nervous. They came on fast and hit hard, turning day into night, and roads into rivers in a matter of minutes. The wind could flip a fully loaded 18-wheeler like it was a toy, and the lightning strikes were frequent enough to be genuinely dangerous. Burl had lost count of how many times he'd seen trees split in half or transformers explode during storms like this, cascades of sparks raining down onto roads and buildings below. He'd learned to respect the weather in a way that some younger drivers hadn't, and that respect had kept him out of trouble more times than he could remember. The first drops of rain started falling around 6 in the evening, fat and heavy and warm. Within minutes, it had escalated to a downpour, sheets of water hammering against Burl's windshield with enough force to make visibility nearly zero. The wind picked up shortly after, rocking his truck on its suspension and howling around the cab like something alive. Burl settled into his sleeper berth with a sandwich and a thermos of coffee, content to wait out the storm in relative comfort. He had a small television mounted in the sleeper that picked up a few local channels, and he watched the news coverage of the storm with detached interest. The meteorologists were practically gleeful as they tracked the system, pointing out rotation in the clouds and warning viewers to take shelter immediately. Burl had seen enough of these weather events to know that while they were certainly dangerous, the actual risk was often overstated for dramatic effect. As long as he stayed put and didn't do anything stupid, he'd be fine. The storm raged for about 2 hours before beginning to move east, the rain tapering off to a steady drizzle and the wind dying down to occasional gusts. Burl watched other drivers starting to fire up their engines and head back out onto the highway, eager to make up lost time. He considered joining them but decided to give it another hour, let the roads drain a bit, and make sure there weren't any downed power lines or flooding on his route. His dispatcher had stopped calling after the first hour of the storm, which Burl took as a good sign that they'd accepted the delay. He made himself another cup of coffee and scrolled through his phone, catching up on messages from his ex-wife about their daughter's upcoming graduation. The conversation was civil enough, all logistics and schedules, but it still made Burl feel the familiar pang of regret about how things had ended between them. The road had seemed more important than family back then, and by the time he'd realized his mistake, it had been too late to fix anything. Around 9 o'clock, Burl decided the weather had cleared enough to get back on the road. He did his post-storm inspection, checking for any damage to his truck or cargo, and found everything intact. The refrigeration unit was running smoothly, maintaining the precise temperature needed to keep his load of frozen foods from spoiling. Burl pulled out of the truck stop and merged onto the highway, joining the moderate flow of traffic heading north. The roads were slick and covered with debris, branches and leaves, and the occasional piece of twisted metal that had been torn loose by the wind. Burl drove carefully, keeping his speed down and watching for standing water that might hide deeper problems beneath the surface. The highway stretched ahead of him through flat farmland, the fields on either side invisible in the darkness beyond his headlights. Arkansas was beautiful country during the day, all rolling hills and dense forests, but at night it could feel oppressively empty, like driving through a void with nothing but the dotted line to guide you. Burl had been driving for about 40 minutes when he came around a long curve and saw something that made him immediately start slowing down. About half a mile ahead, emergency lights were flashing red and blue against the darkness, illuminating what looked like a major accident. As Burl got closer, he could see that a semi-truck had left the road and ended up in the ditch that ran alongside the highway. The trailer had separated from the cab and was lying on its side, its contents spilled across the shoulder and into the adjacent field. Several police cars and an ambulance were already on scene, their lights creating a strobing effect that made it hard to see details clearly. Burl pulled over well before reaching the accident site, not wanting to add to the congestion or get in the way of emergency responders. He grabbed his reflective vest and flashlight from behind his seat and climbed down from his cab, intending to see if there was anything he could do to help. The scene was chaos. Police officers were directing traffic around the accident, waving cars and trucks past while trying to keep rubberneckers from stopping. Burl approached one of the officers and identified himself as a fellow trucker, asking if the driver was okay and whether they needed any assistance. The officer looked stressed and exhausted, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. He told Burl that the driver appeared to be fine, though badly shaken, and that they had the situation under control. But then he paused and looked Burl over, seeming to make some kind of calculation. He asked if Burl had any experience with hazardous materials or knew anything about proper cargo handling. Burl said he'd been driving for 17 years and had hauled just about everything imaginable at one point or another. The officer nodded and told Burl to follow him, leading him away from the main accident site toward where the trailer had come to rest. As they walked, the officer explained that the accident had occurred about an hour ago, right as the worst of the storm was passing through. The driver claimed he'd been moving at a safe speed when a gust of wind had caught his trailer and pushed him off the road. The cab had stayed upright, but the trailer had rolled, breaking the connection and spilling its cargo. That cargo, the officer said, was what had them concerned. The manifest listed standard industrial chemicals, the kind used in agricultural operations throughout the region. Nothing that should have required special handling or raised any red flags. But when the trailer split open and the containers inside broke, they'd released something that didn't match the paperwork. The officer pulled out his phone and showed Burl several photos taken shortly after the accident. The images showed the trailer's interior, lined with drums and containers of various sizes, many of them ruptured and leaking. But what caught Burl's attention was the color of the liquid that had spilled out. It wasn't the clear or slightly tinted fluid you'd expect from agricultural chemicals. It was thick and dark, almost black, and where it had soaked into the ground, the soil seemed to be smoking or steaming. Burl asked what they thought it actually was, and the officer admitted they had no idea. They'd called in a hazmat team from the state capitol, but it would be at least another hour before they arrived. In the meantime, they'd evacuated the driver and the emergency responders who'd gotten too close, after several of them started complaining of burning eyes and difficulty breathing. The officer said they needed someone with cargo experience to help them figure out what they were dealing with, whether it was immediately dangerous or if they had time to wait for the specialists. Burl agreed to take a look, though he had a bad feeling about the whole situation. In his experience, when cargo didn't match its manifest and started making people sick, nothing good was going to come from investigating too closely. But he was here, and he had the knowledge they needed, so he followed the officer toward the overturned trailer, pulling his vest tighter and making sure his flashlight was working properly. The smell hit him before they'd gotten within 50 feet of the wreckage. It was chemical and sharp, burning the inside of Burl's nose and making his eyes water. But underneath that chemical smell was something else. Something organic and rotten that reminded Burl of the time he'd hauled a load of spoiled meat that had been sitting in a broken refrigeration unit for 3 days. The officer stopped at what he deemed a safe distance and told Burl not to get any closer than necessary. Burl nodded and approached the trailer carefully, playing his flashlight beam across the twisted metal and spilled containers. The trailer had been hauling a mixed load, with drums of various sizes secured to pallets. Many of these drums had broken open in the crash, their contents mixing together on the ground and creating the smoking, steaming mess the officer had described. Burl counted at least 30 drums, maybe more, and tried to read the labels on the ones that were still intact. What he saw made him stop in his tracks. The drums were labeled with standard hazmat symbols and shipping codes, but the company names didn't match any suppliers Burl recognized. More troubling was that several of the intact drums had secondary labels, the kind you'd see on military or government shipments, marked with codes and warnings that Burl had only encountered a handful of times in his career. He'd once hauled a load for a defense contractor, medical supplies headed for a military base, and the paperwork had been covered in similar markings. But those had been legitimate government shipments with proper documentation and escorts. These drums looked like someone had taken government property and tried to disguise it as commercial cargo, stripping away the obvious military markings but missing the secondary labels that only experienced drivers would recognize. Burl played his light across the scene again, trying to count how many drums had these hidden military labels, and realized it was most of them. This wasn't a simple case of mislabeled agricultural chemicals. This was something much more serious. Burl returned to where the officer was waiting and explained what he'd found. The military labels, the government codes, the fact that nothing matched the manifest. The officer's expression grew darker with each detail Burl provided. He asked if Burl thought this was some kind of black market operation, maybe stolen military supplies being sold to private buyers. Burl said it was possible, but he was more concerned about what was actually in those drums and why it was causing such severe reactions in anyone who got near it. The officer agreed and said they needed to expand the evacuation zone immediately. He radioed to his colleagues, and within minutes, the perimeter was pushed back another 100 yards. More police cars arrived, along with a fire truck and what looked like the county sheriff's personal vehicle. Burl stood off to the side, watching as officials conferred in tight groups and made urgent phone calls. Whatever was in that trailer, it had just become a major incident, and Burl had the sinking feeling he'd stumbled into something he was going to regret getting involved with. A man in a suit emerged from the sheriff's vehicle and made a beeline for the officer Burl had been speaking with. They had a brief, intense conversation, with the suited man doing most of the talking and the officer occasionally gesturing toward the overturned trailer. Then the suited man turned and looked directly at Burl, his expression unreadable. He walked over and introduced himself as Foster Quill, a regional coordinator for the state's Environmental Protection Agency. Foster asked Burl to explain exactly what he'd seen and what made him think the cargo had military origins. Burl repeated his observations about the labels and codes, trying to be as precise as possible. Foster listened without interrupting, his face growing increasingly grave. When Burl finished, Foster was quiet for a long moment before speaking. He told Burl that what he'd stumbled onto was part of an ongoing investigation into illegal disposal of industrial and military waste, and that the state had been trying to track down the source of these shipments for the past 6 months. According to Foster, someone had been collecting hazardous materials from various sources, everything from old pesticides to experimental chemicals from shuttered research facilities, and mixing them together to create a toxic cocktail that was then being dumped illegally across the state. The dumps were always in remote locations, farmland or forest far from populated areas, and they were being done at night to avoid detection. But the operation had been getting bolder lately, with larger quantities being moved and more frequent dumps. Foster's team had been working with law enforcement to intercept these shipments, but they'd always been one step behind. Now, thanks to the storm and this accident, they finally had their hands on an actual load of the material and a driver who could potentially provide information about the operation. Foster asked if Burl would be willing to stick around and answer more questions once the hazmat team arrived and the scene was secured. Burl agreed, though he was already calculating how much time this was going to add to his delivery schedule and how angry his dispatcher was going to be. The hazmat team arrived about an hour later, 6 people in full protective suits who immediately took control of the scene. They set up containment barriers around the spilled material and began the process of sampling and cataloging everything they found. Burl watched from a distance as they worked with methodical precision, treating the site like it was a crime scene as much as an environmental hazard. Foster spent most of his time on the phone, speaking in low, urgent tones to people Burl assumed were higher up in the state government. At one point, Foster came over and told Burl that the driver of the wrecked truck was being held for questioning, and that state police were in the process of tracing the truck's registration and the company it supposedly belonged to. Foster said they expected to find the whole thing was a front, shell companies stacked on top of each other to hide who was really behind the operation. Burl asked what would happen if they actually caught whoever was responsible, and Foster's expression hardened. He said they'd be looking at federal charges, years in prison, and fines large enough to bankrupt anyone who wasn't a billionaire. Around midnight, Foster told Burl he could go, but asked for contact information in case they needed to follow up with more questions. Burl provided his phone number and the name of his employer, then asked Foster what he should do if he saw something similar on the road in the future. Foster handed him a card with a phone number and said to call immediately. Don't try to investigate on his own, and definitely don't approach any suspicious cargo. Burl thanked him and walked back to his truck, eager to get back on the road and put some distance between himself and this whole mess. But as he climbed into his cab and started the engine, he couldn't shake the feeling that something about this situation didn't add up. The military labels, the government codes, the sophisticated operation to disguise and transport illegal materials. It all pointed to something bigger than just a few criminals trying to make money off illegal dumping. It felt organized, maybe even sanctioned by someone with real power and resources. And if that was true, then stumbling onto this accident might have been the worst piece of luck Burl had experienced in his entire career. Burl pulled back onto the highway and continued north, his mind racing with everything he'd seen. The smoking black liquid, the drums with their hidden labels, the hazmat team treating the site like it was radioactive. He tried to focus on the road ahead, on getting his cargo delivered and getting home, but his thoughts kept returning to that overturned trailer. He'd been around enough chemical spills to know when something was genuinely dangerous, and this had been beyond anything in his experience. The way the ground had reacted where the liquid touched it, almost like it was being eaten away. The severe reactions from people who'd gotten too close. The military codes that suggested this material had originally been created for purposes Burl didn't want to think about too carefully. He found himself checking his mirrors obsessively, half expecting to see police cars or unmarked government vehicles following him, though that was probably just paranoia talking. The highway was mostly empty at this hour, just the occasional car or truck passing in the opposite direction. Burl kept his speed steady and his attention focused, but part of his mind was elsewhere, turning over the details of the accident and trying to make sense of what he'd witnessed. Foster had said this was part of an ongoing investigation, which meant the overturned trailer wasn't an isolated incident. Someone had been doing this for months, moving toxic materials across Arkansas and dumping them where no one would find them until it was too late. Burl wondered how much of this stuff was already out there, buried in farmland or hidden in forests, slowly leaking into groundwater and soil. He thought about the farmers who worked this land, the families who drank well water and grew their own food, completely unaware that they might be living on top of a chemical time bomb. The thought made him angry in a way that surprised him. Burl wasn't usually one for righteous indignation, but something about this situation felt particularly wrong. Around 1 a.m, Burl saw headlights approaching from behind, gaining on him quickly. He checked his mirrors and saw what looked like a pickup truck, moving well above the speed limit. The truck pulled up close behind him, closer than was safe or legal, and stayed there for several minutes. Burl tried changing lanes to let it pass, but the pickup changed lanes too, maintaining its position right on his bumper. Burl felt his anxiety spike. He grabbed his CB radio and tried to raise anyone who might be monitoring the channel, but all he got was static. The pickup stayed locked on his tail for another few miles, close enough that Burl could see 2 figures in the cab, though he couldn't make out any details in the darkness and the glare of their headlights. Then, without warning, the pickup accelerated and pulled alongside Burl's trailer, matching his speed exactly. Burl glanced over and saw the passenger window roll down, and for a moment he thought they were going to try to communicate with him. Instead, something flew out of the window and bounced off his trailer with a metallic clang. The pickup dropped back and then accelerated again, pulling past Burl and disappearing up the highway. Burl's heart was pounding as he tried to figure out what had just happened. Had they thrown something at his truck? Was it a warning, or just some drunk idiots harassing a random trucker? He considered pulling over to check for damage, but decided against it. If that pickup had been following him from the accident site, stopping alone on a dark highway was probably the last thing he should do. Instead, Burl pushed his truck a little faster, eager to reach the next town or truck stop where there would be lights and people and safety in numbers. He kept one eye on his mirrors, watching for any sign that the pickup was coming back, but the road behind him remained empty. Whatever message they'd been trying to send, they seemed satisfied that it had been delivered. Burl reached a small town called Clarksville about 30 minutes later and pulled into a gas station that was thankfully still open despite the late hour. He parked under the bright lights of the fuel island and got out to inspect his trailer. It took him a few minutes to find what the pickup had thrown at him, a rock about the size of a softball, wrapped in what looked like a piece of torn cloth. The rock had dented his trailer slightly but hadn't done any serious damage. Burl unwrapped the cloth and found a message scrawled in black marker. "Mind your business, or next time we won't miss." The words were crude and simple, but their meaning was clear enough. Someone had followed him from the accident site and wanted to make sure he understood the consequences of getting involved. Burl felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the cool night air. He'd been right to be paranoid. This wasn't just some random criminal operation. This was organized, with resources and people willing to use violence to protect it. Burl stood under the harsh fluorescent lights of the gas station, staring at the threatening message wrapped around the rock. His first instinct was to call the police, But something stopped him. The people who'd thrown this at his truck had known exactly where to find him, which meant they'd been watching since he left the accident site. If they could follow him this easily, they probably had connections that went beyond simple criminal enterprise. Calling local cops might just make things worse, especially if whoever was behind this operation had people on the payroll. Instead, Burrell pulled out the card Foster Quill had given him and dialed the number. It rang 4 times before going to voicemail. Burrell left a message explaining what had happened, described the pickup truck as best he could, and said he was continuing to his destination but wanted Foster to know someone was actively threatening witnesses. He hung up and looked around the gas station parking lot, suddenly aware of how exposed he was standing here under the lights. The gas station attendant was watching him through the window, a kid who couldn't have been more than 20 years old. Burrell walked inside and asked if the station had security cameras covering the parking lot. The kid nodded and said they had cameras on all the pumps and the main entrance. Burrell explained that someone had thrown something at his truck, and he wanted to know if the footage might have caught a pickup following him into the lot. The kid seemed uncertain about sharing security footage with a random customer, but Burrell's obvious distress and the professional demeanor he'd cultivated over years of dealing with difficult situations eventually won him over. The kid disappeared into a back office and returned a few minutes later with a grainy printout from the security system. The image quality was poor, but it clearly showed a dark-colored pickup truck with mud-covered license plates pulling into the lot about 30 seconds after Burrell had arrived. The truck had circled through the lot once, as if the occupants were checking to make sure Burrell had gotten their message, then left without stopping. Burrell thanked the kid and asked if he could keep the printout. The attendant said sure, they could print as many copies as needed. Burrell folded the paper carefully and tucked it into his jacket pocket along with the threatening note. He bought coffee and a sandwich he had no appetite for, mostly just to have an excuse to stay inside the well-lit station a little longer. While he ate, he tried to think through his options logically. He could abandon his current load and head straight home, but that would mean explaining to his dispatcher why he'd failed to complete a delivery, and it probably wouldn't stop whoever was threatening him from finding him again. He could go to the police despite his reservations, but without more evidence than a rock and a note. He wasn't sure they'd take the threat seriously enough to provide any real protection. Or he could do what the note said and mind his own business, complete his delivery and hope that staying quiet would be enough to keep him safe. The third option should have been the most appealing, but Burrell found he couldn't quite commit to it. Something about what he'd seen at that accident site, the military labels and the smoking chemical sludge, had gotten under his skin in a way he couldn't ignore. He kept thinking about Foster's comment regarding illegal dumping sites scattered across the state, toxic materials being buried where families lived and worked. Burrell had a daughter who was about to graduate college, planning to move back to Arkansas to start her teaching career. The thought of her living somewhere that might be contaminated by whatever was in those drums made his decision easier. He wasn't going to just walk away and pretend none of this had happened, but he also wasn't stupid enough to confront dangerous people without backup. He needed more information before he could figure out his next move. Burrell finished his coffee and headed back to his truck, checking the parking lot carefully before climbing into the cab. The rock and its threatening message went into his glove box along with the security footage printout. He still had about 4 hours of driving before he reached his delivery point in northern Arkansas, and he planned to use that time to think. The highway was empty as he pulled back onto it, just darkness stretching in all directions and the occasional distant farmhouse light. Burrell kept his speed steady and his senses alert, watching for any sign of the pickup truck returning. His CB radio remained mostly quiet, just occasional bursts of chatter from other drivers too far away to make out clearly. Around 2:30 in the morning, Burrell's phone rang. It was Foster Quill, calling back about the voicemail. Foster sounded exhausted but also deeply concerned. He asked if Burl was somewhere safe, and Burl explained he was back on the highway, heading to complete his delivery. Foster told him that was probably the smartest thing he could do at this point. Just act normal and don't do anything that might draw more attention. The investigation at the accident site had revealed that the drums contained exactly what Foster had feared: a mixture of industrial chemicals, banned pesticides, and what appeared to be waste from some kind of biological research facility. The hazmat team had found traces of compounds that shouldn't exist outside of government-controlled laboratories, stuff that was so dangerous it required special permits and protocols just to transport. Someone had collected all of this material from various sources and was mixing it together, creating something even more toxic than the individual components. The fact that they were then dumping this nightmare cocktail across Arkansas suggested either complete disregard for human life or something more sinister, though Foster couldn't imagine what purpose it could serve beyond making vast swaths of land uninhabitable. Foster said the driver of the wrecked truck had lawyered up immediately and wasn't talking. But state police had traced the truck's registration to a shell company based in Delaware that existed only on paper. Burl asked if Foster had any leads on who might be behind the operation, and there was a long pause before the answer came. Foster said they had suspicions, but nothing concrete enough to act on. The sophistication of the operation, the military-grade materials, the network of shell companies, all of it suggested someone with serious resources and connections. Foster had flagged the case for federal attention, and he expected FBI agents would be involved by morning. In the meantime, he strongly advised Burl to be careful, complete his delivery, and then lay low for a few days until they had a better handle on who they were dealing with. Foster promised to keep Burl updated as the investigation progressed, and told him to call immediately if anyone approached him or if he noticed anything else suspicious. Burl agreed and hung up, feeling only marginally better about the situation. At least Foster was taking the threat seriously, which meant Burl wasn't being paranoid about the danger he might be in. The remainder of the drive passed without incident, though Burl couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every set of headlights that appeared behind him made his pulse quicken, and he found himself taking note of every vehicle he passed, trying to memorize makes and models in case he needed to report them later. By the time he reached his delivery location, a distribution center on the outskirts of a small town called Berryville, dawn was breaking, and Burl felt like he'd aged 10 years overnight. The unloading crew was efficient and professional, and within an hour, Burl was back on the road with an empty trailer, officially done with this particular job. He should have felt relieved, but instead his anxiety was growing. Now that he wasn't focused on making his delivery, his mind was free to fully process everything that had happened, and the implications were becoming clearer and more frightening. Someone was poisoning Arkansas farmland with illegal chemical waste, and they were willing to threaten or possibly harm anyone who interfered with their operation. Burl decided not to head straight home. Instead, he drove to a truck stop about 50 miles south of Berryville and parked in a spot where he could see anyone approaching from any direction. He needed sleep desperately, but he also needed to figure out his next move. He called his ex-wife, something he rarely did outside of scheduled conversations about their daughter, and told her he might be out of contact for a few days due to work complications. She asked if everything was okay, and Burl lied and said it was fine. Just some paperwork issues with a delivery that needed sorting out. They talked briefly about their daughter's upcoming graduation, and Burl promised he'd be there no matter what. After they hung up, Burl sat in his cab and stared at the truck stop, watching other drivers come and go, all of them going about their normal routines without any idea that something deeply wrong was happening in the state they were traveling through. Around 10 in the morning, Burl's phone rang again. This time, it was a number he didn't recognize, a local Arkansas area code. He almost didn't answer, worried it might be whoever had threatened him the night before, but curiosity won out. The voice on the other end was male, older, with the slow, careful drawl of someone who'd spent their entire life in rural Arkansas. The man introduced himself as Wade Tolliver and said he was a farmer who lived not far from where the accident had occurred. Wade explained that he'd been at the accident site early that morning, talking to police and environmental officials about the chemical spill. One of the officers had mentioned that a trucker named Burl Henning had been helpful in identifying the cargo and had provided contact information in case anyone had additional information about the incident. Wade said he had information, but he wasn't comfortable sharing it with government officials for reasons he'd explain if Burl was willing to meet with him in person. Burl's first reaction was suspicion. How had Wade gotten his phone number? Had one of the officers actually given it out? Or was this connected to whoever had threatened him last night? Wade seemed to sense Burl's hesitation and quickly added that he understood if Burl didn't want to get more involved, but that what he had to share was important and potentially dangerous if it fell into the wrong hands. Wade said he'd been finding evidence of illegal dumping on his property for the past 3 months, and he'd been documenting everything he found, taking photos and collecting samples. He'd been planning to go to the authorities, but after seeing how the accident scene was being handled, with state officials and hazmat teams and what looked like federal agents starting to show up, he'd realized this was bigger than he'd thought. He needed to talk to someone who'd seen the cargo firsthand, someone who could help him understand what he was dealing with before he decided whether to go public with what he'd found. Burl asked why Wade thought he could trust him, and Wade's answer was simple. Because Burl had stopped to help at the accident scene instead of just driving past, and because the officers said Burl had seemed genuinely concerned about the environmental impact. Wade said he was 73 years old, had been farming the same land for 50 years, and he wasn't going to let his final years be spent watching his property turn into a toxic waste dump. He needed help, and right now, Burl was the closest thing to an ally he had. Burl thought about this for a long moment. Meeting with Wade could put him in more danger, could draw additional attention from whoever was behind the dumping operation, but it might also provide answers about what was really going on, and maybe even evidence that could help Foster and the authorities shut down the operation permanently. Burl asked where Wade wanted to meet, and Wade gave him directions to a small diner in a town called Jasper, about 40 miles from where Burl was currently parked. The drive to Jasper took Burl through more of the same Arkansas farmland he'd been traveling through for years, but now he saw it differently. Every field and forest could potentially be hiding buried chemical drums. Every stream could be contaminated with toxic runoff. The land looked peaceful in the morning sunlight, but Burl knew appearances could be deceiving. He found the diner easily enough, a classic American establishment that looked like it hadn't changed since the 1970s. Wade had told him to look for an old man in a John Deere cap sitting in the back booth, and Burl spotted him immediately when he walked in. Wade Tolliver looked exactly like what he claimed to be, a weathered farmer with calloused hands and sun-damaged skin, someone who'd spent a lifetime working outdoors. He stood when Burl approached and shook his hand with a grip that was surprisingly strong for someone his age. They ordered coffee and pie from a waitress who clearly knew Wade and treated him with the familiar respect small-town folks reserved for long-time residents. Once she'd left, Wade pulled out a folder from the bag at his feet and laid it on the table between them. Inside were dozens of photographs showing disturbed soil, patches of dead vegetation, and what looked like partially buried metal drums. Wade explained that he'd first noticed something wrong about 3 months ago when a section of his cornfield had failed to produce any crop at all. The soil in that area had turned dark and oily, and when he'd tried to dig into it, he'd found 3 drums buried about 4 feet down. He'd been smart enough not to open them, but he'd photographed them extensively and then called the county environmental office to report the find. They'd sent someone out to take a look, But according to Wade, the inspector had seemed more interested in downplaying the situation than investigating it properly. The inspector had told Wade the drums were probably old agricultural waste from decades ago, nothing to worry about, and had filed a report that essentially closed the case. But Wade hadn't been satisfied with that answer. He'd started systematically searching his property, all 800 acres of it, looking for more evidence of dumping. He'd found 6 more burial sites, each containing multiple drums, and he'd documented all of them. He'd also started asking around among his neighbors, and several of them had reported similar discoveries on their land. Most had followed the inspector's advice and stopped investigating, but a few had contacted private environmental testing companies and had their soil analyzed. The results had been alarming. Concentrations of heavy metals and toxic compounds well above safe levels, with some areas contaminated badly enough that the testing companies had recommended the land be declared a Superfund site. Wade had collected copies of these test results, and they were all in the folder along with his photographs. He told Burrell that he'd been planning to take all of this evidence to the state environmental agency, but after seeing the response to last night's accident, he was now convinced that local and state officials already knew about the dumping and were either incompetent or complicit. Burrell looked through the folder, his stomach churning as he reviewed the documentation. This wasn't just a few isolated incidents. This was a systematic contamination of farmland across multiple properties, affecting dozens of families and potentially thousands of acres. Wade's photographs showed clear patterns, with burial sites following property lines and access roads, suggesting whoever was doing the dumping had detailed maps and knowledge of the area. Some of the drums visible in the photos had the same secondary military labels Burrell had seen on the cargo from last night's accident, confirming that this was all connected. Burrell asked Wade if he'd noticed any suspicious activity on his property, trucks coming and going at odd hours or people surveying his land. Wade said he hadn't seen anything personally, but one of his neighbors claimed to have spotted trucks with covered trailers driving through the area late at night, always taking back roads and avoiding the main highways. Wade leaned forward and lowered his voice, even though the diner was nearly empty and nobody was sitting close enough to overhear. He said he'd been doing some research into who owned the properties where dumping had been discovered, and he'd found something disturbing. Over the past 2 years, several of the affected farms had been quietly purchased by the same investment group, a company called Tallgrass Agricultural Holdings. The sales had been handled discreetly, with non-disclosure agreements and terms that prevented the former owners from discussing the transactions. Wade had managed to track down one of these former owners, a man who'd farmed his whole life before suddenly selling his land and moving to Florida. The man had been reluctant to talk, but Wade had eventually convinced him to share at least some of what had happened. According to this former farmer, Tallgrass had approached him with an offer to buy his property at well above market value, but only if he agreed to leave immediately and never return. When he'd asked why they were willing to pay so much, they'd told him the land had been contaminated by industrial dumping and was essentially worthless for agricultural purposes. They were buying it as part of a cleanup effort, they claimed, but they needed all the former owners gone so they could work without interference. Burrell asked if Wade thought Tallgrass was behind the dumping, using contamination as an excuse to buy up farmland cheaply and then resell it for development or other purposes. Wade said that's exactly what he thought, and he believed the dumping was deliberate, a way to force farmers off their land without having to pay fair prices. Once they'd contaminated an area badly enough, they could buy it for pennies on the dollar, then either sit on it until the contamination naturally degraded or use their connections to get the land reclassified as non-agricultural so it could be developed. Wade said he'd found records of Tallgrass acquiring more than 15,000 acres across central Arkansas over the past 2 years, and every single one of those properties had been purchased under similar circumstances. If his theory was correct, This wasn't just illegal dumping. This was a coordinated land grab, using environmental terrorism to drive farmers into financial ruin so they'd be forced to sell. Burl sat back in the booth, trying to process what Wade was telling him. If this was true, it explained the military-grade chemicals and the sophisticated operation. Whoever was behind Tallgrass had resources and connections that went far beyond typical criminals. They were willing to poison vast stretches of land and threaten anyone who got in their way, all in pursuit of profit. Burl asked Wade what he planned to do with all this evidence, and Wade's answer was simple. He wanted to go to the FBI directly, bypass local and state officials entirely, and hope that federal agents would take the situation seriously enough to investigate. But he needed someone who could corroborate the cargo details from last night's accident, someone who'd seen firsthand what was being transported. That's where Burl came in. Wade wanted him to come with him to the nearest FBI field office, scheduled to open in 2 hours, and present everything they had together. Burl's first instinct was to refuse. He'd already been threatened once, and involving himself further could put him in serious danger. But looking at the evidence in Wade's folder, thinking about all the families living on contaminated land without knowing it, he found he couldn't walk away. His daughter was planning to move back to Arkansas, and for all Burl knew, she might end up living somewhere affected by this dumping. He'd spent 17 years driving trucks across this state, eating in its diners, and sleeping in its truck stops. Building a career on the roads that connected its communities, he owed something to the place that had given him a livelihood, even if paying that debt meant putting himself at risk. Burl told Wade he'd do it. They'd go to the FBI together and present everything they had, and hope it was enough to start a real investigation. Wade's relief was visible, his weathered face relaxing into something approaching a smile. He said he'd been prepared to go alone if necessary, but having Burl's testimony about the cargo would make their case much stronger. They spent the next hour going through all of Wade's evidence, organizing it in a way that would make sense to federal investigators. Wade had been thorough, documenting dates and locations and connecting everything to public records about property sales and corporate filings. Between his evidence and Burl's first-hand account of the accident scene, they had the foundation for a compelling case that something seriously criminal was happening in Arkansas. Around 11:30, they paid for their coffee and pie and headed out to the parking lot. Wade's truck was an old Ford that had clearly seen better days, but it started reliably enough. They agreed that Wade would follow Burl to the FBI field office in Little Rock, a drive that would take about 2 hours. Burl climbed into his truck and pulled out of the diner parking lot, checking his mirrors to make sure Wade was behind him. The drive back south felt longer than it should have, every mile filled with anticipation and worry about what would happen once they reached the FBI. About 40 minutes into the drive, Burl noticed a vehicle that had been maintaining the same distance behind Wade's truck for the past several miles. It was a dark sedan, possibly the same color as the pickup from last night, though Burl couldn't be certain from this distance. He tried to get a better look using his mirrors, but the sedan hung back just far enough to make identification difficult. Burl grabbed his CB radio and tried to raise Wade, but got no response. He'd given Wade his cell number at the diner, so Burl called him instead. Wade answered on the third ring, and Burl asked if he'd noticed the sedan following them. Wade checked his mirror and confirmed he could see it, then asked if Burl thought they were being followed. Burl said he didn't know for sure, but they should assume the worst and take precautions. He told Wade to stay close and not to stop for anything until they reached the FBI office. They continued driving, and the sedan continued following at the same steady distance. Burl tried to convince himself it was just coincidence, that this was a public highway, and other people had legitimate reasons to be traveling the same route. But his instincts told him otherwise. Someone knew what they were planning and was monitoring their movements, waiting to see if they'd actually go through with reporting to federal authorities. Burrell called Foster Quill and explained the situation, and Foster immediately told him to call 911 if the sedan made any aggressive moves. Foster said he'd alert the FBI field office that they were coming and what they were bringing with them, so agents would be ready to take their statements as soon as they arrived. Foster also said he'd send a message to state police asking them to be on alert for any vehicles matching the sedan's description. Burrell thanked him and hung up, then focused on driving as carefully as possible. The last thing they needed was to get into an accident before they could deliver their evidence. The sedan stayed with them for another hour, never getting closer but never falling behind enough to lose visual contact. As they approached Little Rock, traffic began to increase and Burrell started to hope they'd lose the sedan in the urban congestion. But whoever was driving seemed to be an expert at surveillance, maintaining their tail even as other vehicles moved between them. Burrell could feel his heart pounding as they exited the highway and began navigating city streets toward the FBI field office. According to his GPS, they were less than 5 minutes away when the sedan suddenly accelerated, pulling alongside Wade's truck in the lane next to him. Burrell watched in horror as the sedan's passenger window rolled down and something was thrown toward Wade's vehicle. There was a flash of fire and smoke, and Wade's truck swerved violently before crashing into a parked car on the side of the street. Burrell slammed on his brakes and pulled over immediately, his truck screeching to a halt about 50 feet past where Wade's vehicle had crashed. He threw open his door and jumped down, running back toward the smoking wreckage. The sedan that had thrown the projectile was already accelerating away, disappearing into traffic before Burrell could get a clear look at the license plate. Other drivers were stopping as well, some pulling out phones to call 911, others just staring in shock at the scene. Burrell reached Wade's truck and found the driver's side door crumpled from impact with the parked car. The window had been blown out by whatever had been thrown at it, and smoke was billowing from the interior. Through the haze, Burrell could see Wade slumped over the steering wheel, blood running down the side of his face from a cut on his forehead. Burrell tried the door, but it was jammed shut from the collision. He ran around to the passenger side and found that door was damaged as well, but not as badly. After several hard yanks, he managed to get it open enough to reach inside. Wade was conscious but dazed, mumbling something Burrell couldn't understand. The smell inside the truck was acrid and chemical, and Burrell realized that whatever had been thrown through the window was still smoldering on the seat next to Wade. It looked like some kind of homemade incendiary device, a glass bottle filled with liquid and wrapped with a burning rag. The bottle had shattered on impact, and the liquid had splashed across the seat and floor, filling the cab with toxic fumes. Burrell knew he needed to get Wade out immediately before the fumes overwhelmed him or the fire spread. He reached across Wade's body and unfastened the seatbelt, then grabbed the older man under his arms and pulled with all his strength. Wade was heavier than he looked, solid muscle built from decades of farm work, but adrenaline gave Burrell the strength he needed. He managed to drag Wade out of the truck and away from the vehicle, laying him down on the sidewalk about 20 feet from the wreckage. Other bystanders had gathered by now, and someone said an ambulance was on the way. Burrell knelt beside Wade and checked his vital signs as best he could. Wade's pulse was strong, and his breathing seemed normal despite the smoke exposure, but the cut on his head was bleeding heavily, and his eyes weren't quite focusing properly. Burrell pulled off his jacket and pressed it against the wound, applying pressure to slow the bleeding. Wade's eyes finally found Burrell's face, and recognition flickered in them. He tried to speak, his voice coming out as a hoarse whisper. He said something about the folder, about the evidence they'd been bringing to the FBI. Burrell looked back at Wade's truck and saw smoke was now pouring from the broken windows in earnest. Whatever was burning inside was spreading, and within minutes the whole cab would be engulfed. The folder, with all of Wade's documentation, the photographs and soil test results and property records, was still inside the truck. Without that evidence, they had nothing concrete to present to federal investigators, just their testimony, which could easily be dismissed or discredited. Burl made a split-second decision that he'd spend the rest of his life questioning. He told Wade to stay put and keep pressure on the wound, then ran back toward the burning truck. Several bystanders shouted at him to stop, that it was too dangerous, but Burl ignored them. He reached the passenger door and could feel the heat radiating from inside even before he looked in. The fire had spread from the initial impact point and was now consuming the seat cushions and climbing up the door panels. Burl could see the folder on the floor of the passenger side, partially hidden under debris from the shattered window. He took a deep breath, held it, and reached into the cab. The heat was intense and the smoke immediately made his eyes water. His fingers found the folder, and he grabbed it, pulling it free just as flames licked across the dashboard. He stumbled backward, clutching the folder to his chest, and got about 10 steps away before the truck's gas tank ignited with a dull whump that knocked him off his feet. Burl hit the pavement hard, the folder flying from his hands and scattering papers across the sidewalk. He rolled over and looked back to see Wade's truck fully engulfed in flames, black smoke billowing into the sky. His ears were ringing from the explosion, and he could feel burns on his hands and face where the heat had touched him. But he was alive, and more importantly, he'd recovered the evidence. Other people rushed over to help him, asking if he was okay, pulling him further from the burning vehicle. Burl nodded numbly and started gathering the scattered papers, shoving them back into the folder with shaking hands. Someone brought him a bottle of water, and he used it to cool his burned hands, hissing at the pain. In the distance, sirens were approaching, multiple emergency vehicles converging on the scene. Burl looked over to where Wade was lying and saw that an off-duty nurse had taken over applying pressure to his wound. Wade's eyes found Burl's again, and he mouthed 2 words. "Thank you." The ambulance arrived first, followed quickly by police cars and a fire truck. Paramedics split into 2 teams, one working on Wade and the other checking Burl for injuries. Burl's burns were mostly first-degree, painful but not serious, and the paramedics treated them with cooling gel and bandages. Wade was in worse shape with a possible concussion and definite smoke inhalation, so they loaded him onto a stretcher and prepared to transport him to the hospital. Before they could take him away, Burl pushed past the paramedics and pressed the folder into Wade's hands. He told Wade to give this to the FBI, to tell them everything, and not to let anyone take it from him until federal agents had seen every page. Wade gripped the folder like it was the most precious thing in the world and nodded. Then the paramedics loaded him into the ambulance and drove away, sirens wailing. Burl gave his statement to the police, explaining about the sedan that had followed them and thrown the incendiary device. He described the vehicle as best he could, though he hadn't gotten a clear look at the license plate or the occupants. The officers took notes and assured him they'd review traffic camera footage from the area to try to identify the vehicle. One of them asked why Burl and Wade had been targeted, and Burl explained about the illegal dumping operation and the evidence they'd been planning to present to the FBI. The officer's expression changed when he heard this, becoming more serious and concerned. He excused himself and made a phone call, speaking in low tones that Burl couldn't quite hear. When he returned, he told Burl that FBI agents were on their way to take over the investigation, and that Burl should wait at the scene until they arrived. Burl agreed, though every instinct told him he should leave immediately and put as much distance as possible between himself and whatever was happening here. The FBI agents arrived about 20 minutes later. 2 men in suits who introduced themselves, but whose names Burl immediately forgot in his shocked and exhausted state. They took Burl to one of their vehicles and interviewed him extensively, asking detailed questions about everything that had happened since he'd stopped at the accident scene the previous night. Burl told them everything. The military labels on the drums, Foster Quill's investigation, the threatening message thrown at his truck, his meeting with Wade, and the evidence they'd been bringing to present to federal authorities. The agents listened without interrupting, taking notes and occasionally asking for clarification on specific points. When Burl finished, there was a long pause before one of the agents told him something that made his blood run cold. They'd already been investigating Tallgrass Agricultural Holdings for the past 4 months, as part of a larger probe into organized crime connections to environmental crimes across multiple states. According to the agents, Tallgrass was a front company for a criminal organization that had developed a lucrative side business in illegal waste disposal. They'd charge industrial clients and government facilities enormous fees to properly dispose of hazardous materials. Then, instead of actually following proper disposal procedures, they'd simply dump everything on remote farmland and pocket the difference. The land contamination was a bonus from their perspective, because it allowed them to buy up the properties at reduced prices and either resell them for development or use them as future dumping sites. The organization had been operating for at least 5 years, possibly longer, and the agents estimated they'd already contaminated more than 50,000 acres across Arkansas, Missouri, and Oklahoma. The profits from the scheme were in the hundreds of millions of dollars, which explained why they were willing to use violence to protect their operation. The agent said that Wade's evidence, combined with the cargo from last night's accident, would provide the concrete proof they needed to move forward with arrests and prosecutions. Burl asked if he and Wade were in danger now that they'd come forward, and the agent's answer wasn't reassuring. They said protective custody could be arranged if necessary, but their best assessment was that the organization would be more focused on damage control than retaliation at this point. The accident and the attack on Wade had drawn too much attention, and going after witnesses now would only make things worse for them. The agents believed the people behind Tallgrass would be more likely to destroy evidence and flee than to continue attacking anyone. Burl wanted to believe this, but the memory of that sedan following them and the incendiary device crashing through Wade's window was too fresh. These people had already demonstrated they were willing to use violence, and he wasn't convinced they'd suddenly become cautious just because federal investigators were involved. The agents gave Burl their contact information and told him to call immediately if he felt threatened or noticed anything suspicious. They also asked him to stay available for the next few weeks, as he'd likely need to testify before a grand jury once indictments were filed. After the FBI agents finished with him, Burl was finally allowed to leave the scene. His truck had been towed to a nearby impound lot to preserve it as evidence, since the rock and threatening note in his glove box were now relevant to a federal investigation. The agents arranged for a rental car so Burl could get home, and one of them drove him to pick it up. During the drive, the agent told Burl that he'd done the right thing by stopping to help at the accident scene and by agreeing to testify about what he'd seen. The agent said most people would have just driven past and minded their own business, and because of that, a massive criminal operation would have continued poisoning communities for years to come. Burl didn't feel like a hero. He felt exhausted and scared, and deeply uncertain about whether he'd made the right choices. But he thanked the agent anyway and collected his rental car, a compact sedan that felt strange after years of driving an 18-wheeler. The drive back to his apartment took about 3 hours, and Burl spent most of that time replaying everything that had happened over the past day and a half. He thought about that first sight of the overturned trailer at the accident scene, the drums with their hidden military labels leaking their toxic contents into the soil. He thought about Foster Quill's grave expression as he'd explained the scope of the illegal dumping operation. He thought about Wade Tolliver's weathered face and steady determination to protect his land and his community. And he thought about that moment when he'd run back into the burning truck to save the evidence, knowing it could have cost him his life but unable to walk away. Burl had spent 17 years on the road, hauling cargo from one place to another without getting particularly involved in the communities he passed through. He'd always thought of himself as just passing through, not really part of any place. But the events of the past 2 days had shown him that wasn't true. He was part of Arkansas whether he acknowledged it or not, and what happened to its land and its people mattered to him more than he'd realized. When Burl finally reached his apartment, it was early evening and the sun was setting in streaks of orange and red across the western sky. He parked the rental car and sat for a moment, staring at the building where he'd lived for the past 8 years. It was a modest place, nothing special, but it was home in a way that his truck cab had never quite been. Burl climbed out of the car, wincing as his burned hands protested the movement, and made his way upstairs to his unit. Inside, everything was exactly as he'd left it before heading out on what he'd thought would be a routine delivery. His kitchen was clean, his bed was made, and his refrigerator hummed quietly in the corner. The normalcy of it all felt surreal after what he'd been through. Burl took a long shower, letting the hot water wash away the smoke smell and the grime from the road, then bandaged his burns with supplies from his first aid kit. He tried to eat something but found he had no appetite, so he settled for coffee and sat on his couch, staring at the wall and trying to process his thoughts. Around 8 o'clock, his phone rang. It was Foster Quill, calling to check on him. Foster had heard about the attack on Wade's truck and wanted to make sure Burl was okay. Burl assured him he was fine, just shaken up and dealing with some minor burns. Foster said the FBI had already contacted him and requested copies of all his documentation from the accident scene investigation. He'd spent the afternoon at his office, compiling everything he had and preparing it for federal agents. Foster said he'd also heard from the hospital where Wade was being treated, and the prognosis was good. Wade had a concussion and would need to stay overnight for observation, but he was expected to make a full recovery. The folder with all his evidence had been delivered to the FBI field office, and agents were already analyzing the contents and preparing search warrants for properties owned by Tallgrass Agricultural Holdings. Foster sounded energized, almost excited, in a way Burl had never heard from him before. This case was going to be the biggest environmental crime prosecution in Arkansas history, and Foster had been instrumental in bringing it to light. Burl congratulated Foster and they talked for a few more minutes about what would happen next in the investigation. Foster expected that within a week, federal agents would be executing raids on tallgrass properties and bringing in the people behind the operation for questioning. The evidence was strong enough that conviction seemed almost certain, assuming the defendants didn't flee before they could be arrested. Foster also mentioned that he'd been contacted by several journalists who'd gotten wind of the story and wanted to interview everyone involved. Burl immediately said he wasn't interested in talking to the media, and Foster seemed to understand. He said the attention would die down eventually, and in the meantime, Burl should focus on taking care of himself and recovering from the trauma of what he'd experienced. They agreed to stay in touch as the investigation progressed, and Foster promised to keep Burl updated on any major developments. After they hung up, Burl felt slightly better knowing that things were moving forward and that Wade's evidence was in the hands of people who could actually do something with it. Over the following week, Burl tried to return to some semblance of normalcy. His dispatcher had been understanding about the delays and complications with his last delivery, especially after Burl explained that he'd been involved in a federal investigation. The company was actually pleased to have one of their drivers helping law enforcement, seeing it as good publicity. Burl was offered several new hauling assignments, but he turned them all down, telling his dispatcher he needed a few weeks off to deal with stress and recover from his injuries. The truth was that Burl wasn't sure he wanted to go back on the road at all. Something had changed in him during those hours at the accident scene and in Wade's burning truck. He'd spent nearly 2 decades as an observer, passing through places without really seeing them, and now he couldn't unsee what he'd witnessed. Every time he thought about getting back in a truck cab and driving through Arkansas farmland, he imagined all the buried drums leaking their toxic contents into the soil, all the families living on contaminated land without knowing the danger they were in. Burl started following news coverage of the investigation obsessively, reading every article and watching every report he could find. The story had grown bigger than he'd expected, with national media picking it up and state officials scrambling to respond to revelations about the scope of the contamination. Foster Quill became something of a local hero, doing interviews where he explained the environmental impact and the work his team had done to identify the problem. Wade Tolliver was also featured in several articles, portrayed as a determined farmer who'd refused to let criminals destroy his land. Burl's name was mentioned occasionally as the truck driver who'd first identified the suspicious cargo, but he'd successfully avoided any interview requests. He preferred to remain in the background, watching events unfold without being at the center of them. The FBI made their first arrests about 10 days after the incident, taking 6 people into custody in coordinated raids across 3 states. More arrests were expected as the investigation continued to uncover the full extent of the criminal network. About 2 weeks after everything had happened, Burl received a visitor at his apartment. It was Wade Tolliver, looking remarkably healthy considering what he'd been through. The cut on his forehead had healed into a thin scar that would probably fade with time, and his eyes were clear and focused. Wade said he'd been released from the hospital after 2 days and had spent the time since then working with federal investigators and environmental cleanup crews who were beginning the process of identifying and securing all the contaminated sites on his property. The cleanup would take years and cost millions of dollars, but the government had assured him the costs would be covered through asset forfeiture from the criminal organization once convictions were obtained. Wade had come to thank Burl personally for saving the evidence from his burning truck. He said the FBI had told him that without that documentation, building their case would have been much more difficult and taken considerably longer. Wade had brought a gift, a framed photograph of his farm taken before the contamination had been discovered, showing vast fields of corn stretching toward distant tree lines under a brilliant blue sky. Burl accepted the photograph and invited Wade in for coffee. They sat in Burl's small living room and talked for over an hour, sharing their thoughts about what they'd been through and what it meant. Wade said the experience had reinforced his belief that ordinary people had to stand up against powerful interests when those interests threatened their communities and their way of life. He couldn't have fought tall grass alone, and Burl couldn't have brought them down without Wade's evidence, but together they'd managed to expose something that needed to be exposed. Wade asked what Burl planned to do now, whether he'd go back to trucking or try something different. Burl admitted he didn't know. The road had been his life for so long that he couldn't imagine doing anything else, but he also couldn't imagine getting back in a truck and pretending nothing had changed. Wade suggested that Burl take his time deciding, that sometimes the best thing you could do after trauma was to sit still and let yourself heal before making major life decisions. After Wade left, Burl hung the photograph on his living room wall where he could see it from his couch. He stared at it for a long time, thinking about all the work and care that had gone into creating those fields, and all the ways that criminals had tried to destroy them for profit. The image represented something important that Burl had never fully appreciated before: the connection between land and people, the way communities were built on the soil they cultivated and the water they drank. As a trucker, Burl had moved across the surface of that connection without understanding its depth. He'd been focused on schedules and routes and deliveries, treating the landscape as nothing more than miles to be covered. Now he understood that every place he passed through had its own story, its own struggles, its own people trying to protect what mattered to them. He couldn't drive through Arkansas anymore without thinking about the buried drums and the families at risk, and he suspected that awareness would follow him wherever he went. 3 weeks after the incident, Burrell received a call from one of the FBI agents who'd interviewed him. The agent said they'd tracked down the sedan that had attacked Wade's truck and identified the 2 men who'd thrown the incendiary device. Both were low-level operatives working for Tallgrass, and both had agreed to cooperate with investigators in exchange for reduced sentences. Their testimony had led to additional arrests higher up in the organization, including several people who'd been directly involved in planning and executing the illegal dumping operations. The agent said Burrell would definitely need to testify when the case went to trial, probably sometime in the next year. But in the meantime, he could rest easier knowing the immediate threat had been neutralized. The agent also mentioned that the state of Arkansas was planning to create a new environmental monitoring program, specifically focused on detecting and preventing illegal dumping, and that they were using this case as the catalyst for increased funding and oversight. What Burrell and Wade had done would have lasting positive effects on the state's environmental protection efforts. Burrell thanked the agent and hung up, feeling a complex mixture of emotions. Relief that the people who'd threatened him were in custody, satisfaction that the investigation was producing real results, but also a lingering unease about how close he'd come to being seriously hurt or killed. He thought about that moment when the incendiary device had crashed through Wade's window, how different things could have been if they'd been traveling just a little faster or slower, if the timing had been off by even a few seconds. Burrell had been lucky, but luck wasn't something you could count on indefinitely. He'd put himself in danger for the right reasons, and things had worked out. But he knew he couldn't make a habit of it. He wasn't a law enforcement officer or an environmental investigator. He was a truck driver who'd happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, or maybe the right place at the right time, depending on how you looked at it. A month after everything had happened, Burrell finally made his decision about returning to work. He called his dispatcher and said he was ready to take on new assignments, but with some conditions. He wanted to stay on regional routes within Arkansas and neighboring states, no more long-haul trips that kept him away for weeks at a time. He wanted to be closer to home, closer to the places and people he'd helped protect. The dispatcher agreed to the new arrangement, and within a few days Burrell was back behind the wheel, hauling cargo on routes he'd traveled hundreds of times before. But everything looked different now. Every farm he passed made him wonder about its soil and water quality. Every small town made him think about the families living there and what threats they might be facing without knowing it. Burrell found himself paying attention to details he'd never noticed before. Environmental monitoring equipment at industrial sites, trucks with hazmat placards, official vehicles from state and federal agencies. He'd developed an awareness he couldn't turn off, a heightened sensitivity to the ways humans interacted with and impacted the land around them. Burrell stayed in touch with both Foster Quill and Wade Tolliver's over the months that followed, exchanging occasional calls and messages about the progress of the investigation and cleanup efforts. Foster kept Burrell updated on the legal proceedings against Tallgrass and the individuals who'd been arrested, which were moving forward despite aggressive defense tactics and attempts to delay trial. Wade sent regular updates about the remediation work on his farm, which had become something of a model project for how to properly clean up large-scale chemical contamination. Environmental groups had taken an interest in Wade's case, and he'd become an advocate for stronger regulations and oversight of waste disposal practices. Both Foster and Wade credited Burrell with being the catalyst that brought everything to light, though Burrell consistently downplayed his role. He'd just stopped to help at an accident scene, he'd tell them. Anyone would have done the same, but Burrell knew that wasn't true. Most drivers would have kept going, not wanting to get involved, not wanting to risk delays or complications with their deliveries. Burrell had made different choices, and those choices had mattered in ways he was still discovering. He'd learned that being a witness to something wrong carried responsibilities, that knowing about injustice created an obligation to act even when acting was dangerous or inconvenient. These weren't lessons he'd expected to learn from his years on the road, but they were lessons that had changed him fundamentally. He wasn't the same person who'd pulled over at that accident scene 4 weeks ago. That Burl had been focused narrowly on his own concerns, his own schedule, his own small corner of the world. This Burl understood that his corner was connected to everyone else's, that the road he traveled on linked him to communities and struggles he'd been ignoring for too long. 6 months after the initial incident, the trial began for the first group of defendants connected to the tallgrass dumping operation. Burl testified on the second day, spending 3 hours on the witness stand describing what he'd seen at the accident scene and the events that had followed. The defense attorneys tried to shake his testimony, suggesting he'd misread labels or misunderstood what he was seeing, but Burl's 17 years of experience handling cargo made him a credible witness. The jury seemed to pay close attention to his account, particularly when he described the military markings on the drums and the toxic smoke that had forced emergency responders to evacuate. Wade testified after Burl, presenting his documentation of the buried drums and the systematic contamination of his property. Foster Quill testified about his investigation and the scope of environmental damage across the region. Together, their testimony painted a damning picture of a criminal enterprise that had operated with impunity for years, poisoning land and threatening lives in pursuit of profit. The verdicts came back 3 weeks later. Guilty on all counts for all defendants. The judge handed down sentences ranging from 15 to 30 years in federal prison, along with millions of dollars in fines and restitution orders. More trials were scheduled for additional defendants as the investigation continued to expand, but this first conviction was seen as a major victory for environmental justice in Arkansas. News coverage was extensive, with editorials praising the ordinary citizens who'd stood up against powerful criminal interests. Burl received calls from journalists wanting to interview him about the experience, but he declined all of them. He'd said what needed to be said in court, and he had no interest in becoming a public figure. He just wanted to go back to his truck and his routes, to the familiar rhythm of the road and the quiet solitude of the cab. But the road had changed for Burl, or rather his perception of it had changed. He couldn't drive through Arkansas anymore without seeing it as something more than just terrain to cross. Every field and forest had stories, every community had struggles, and Burl was part of all of it whether he'd acknowledged it before or not. He'd learned that you couldn't truly pass through a place without being affected by it and affecting it in turn. The connections were always there, invisible but real, linking him to people he'd never meet and consequences he'd never fully understand. That knowledge was both humbling and empowering, a reminder that individual choices mattered even when they seemed insignificant. On a clear evening, about 8 months after everything had started, Burl was driving through familiar Arkansas farmland on his way home from a delivery. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, and the fields stretched away on both sides of the highway in patterns of dark soil and green growth. Burl slowed his truck and pulled onto the shoulder, getting out to stretch his legs and take in the view. The air smelled of earth and growing things, that particular scent of rural Arkansas that he'd experienced 1,000 times without really noticing. Now he noticed everything. The texture of the soil, the health of the crops, the quality of the water in the irrigation ditches. He thought about Wade Tolliver working to restore his contaminated land, and Foster Quill continuing his environmental monitoring, and all the families who could sleep a little easier knowing that one source of poison had been eliminated from their world. Burl climbed back into his truck and continued toward home, watching the sunset fade into twilight. He had a delivery scheduled for tomorrow, Another routine haul across familiar territory, and he was ready for it. The fear that had haunted him in the weeks after the incident had mostly faded, replaced by a cautious confidence that he'd done the right thing and survived to tell about it. He knew he'd been lucky, that things could have ended very differently, but he also knew that luck favored those who acted when action was needed. Burl had acted, and in doing so, he'd learned something essential about himself and the world he moved through. The road wasn't just a means of getting from one place to another. It was a connection between communities, a thread that linked struggles and stories and lives in ways that weren't always visible, but were always present. And Burl was part of that connection now, permanently and irrevocably, in ways that would shape the rest of his life. As darkness settled over the Arkansas landscape and his headlights carved a tunnel through the night, Burl thought about all the miles he'd traveled, and all the miles still ahead. The road stretched on endlessly as it always had, but now he understood what it carried and what moved along it. Not just cargo and commerce, but stories and secrets, dangers and discoveries, the whole complicated truth of human existence played out on asphalt and dirt. He'd been driving these roads for 17 years, but in a sense, he was just beginning to truly see them. And that vision, hard-won and sometimes frightening, was something he'd carry with him for whatever miles remained.